Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Lost Library of Alexandria. Get comfortable. Adjust your pillows. Let your breathing slow. And prepare yourself for a long journey through time. Tonight we travel back more than 2 millennia to explore one of history's most profound mysteries. This is a story that will take us through the rise and fall of empires, through the minds of history's greatest thinkers, and through the corridors of the most magnificent library the ancient world had ever seen. Close your eyes and let the story wash over you like gentle waves upon an ancient shore. Part 1. The World Before Alexandria. To understand the Library of Alexandria, we must first understand that it did not spring from nothing. The concept of gathering and preserving written knowledge was already ancient when Alexandria was founded. In Mesopotamia, the great cities of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, clay tablets had been collected and preserved for thousands of years. Picture these early archives. Rooms filled with clay tablets, each one carefully inscribed with cuneiform writing, organized by subject matter, labeled and cataloged. The Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, founded in the 7th century BCE, contained over 30,000 clay tablets covering everything from royal decrees to medical texts, from astronomical observations to epic poetry. When archaeologists discovered this library in the 19th century, they found tablets labeled with what we would recognize as library classification system. Palace of Ashurbanipal, King of the World, King of Assyria. In ancient Egypt, the temple served as a repository of knowledge. The House of Life, or Puran, existed at major temples throughout the land. These were scriptoriums where priests copied sacred texts, medical papyri, astronomical tables, and magical spells. The priests who worked in these houses were highly trained scribes who spent years mastering the complex hieroglyphic, hieratic, and later Demotic scripts. They preserved the accumulated wisdom of Egyptian civilization, which stretched back thousands of years even in Alexander's time. In ancient Greece, the love of learning had created smaller collections. Aristotle himself had assembled a significant personal library at his Lyceum in Athens. This library became legendary, and it's said that Ptolemy I, who had studied under Aristotle, was inspired by his teacher's example when founding the Library of Alexandria. Aristotle's library contained not just literary work, but also his own extensive notes on natural history, politics, ethics, and metaphysics. He had sent researchers throughout the Greek world to collect specimens and information, creating what might be considered one of the first systematic research libraries. The Greek tyrant Pisistratus of Athens had established a public library in the 6th century BCE, and by the 4th century BCE, book collecting had become fashionable among wealthy Greeks. Private libraries, though smaller than what Alexandria would become, were markers of education and sophistication. But Alexandria would be different. Alexandria would attempt something unprecedented, to gather not just Greek knowledge, but all human knowledge. Every book, every scroll, every written word from every culture that could be reached. It was an ambitious, even audacious goal, and for a time, it nearly succeeded. Alexander the Great, the vision of a city. Our story truly begins with a young man who would change the world. Alexander III of Macedon, whom history would call the Great, was born in 356 BCE in Pella, the capital of the ancient Greek kingdom of Macedonia. Let us picture the young Alexander. His father, Philip II, had transformed Macedonia from a backwater kingdom into a military powerhouse. Philip had conquered and unified the fractious Greek city-states, creating an empire that stretched from the Adriatic to the Black Sea. But Philip was more than a warrior. He valued Greek culture and learning, and he'd hired the best tutor money could buy for his son, Aristotle. For 3 years, from 343 to 340 BCE, Aristotle taught Alexander and a small group of the sons of Macedonian nobles at the Temple of the Nymphs at Mysa. Imagine these lessons. Aristotle, perhaps the greatest mind of the age, walking through gardens with the young prince who would conquer the known world. They discussed Homer's epics. Aristotle prepared a special edition of the Iliad for Alexander, which the young prince would carry with him throughout his campaigns. They studied medicine, philosophy, morality, religion, logic, and art. Aristotle instilled in Alexander a love of learning that would never leave him. Throughout his conquests, Alexander would send back specimens, plants, animals, minerals, to his former teacher. When Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, he seized the royal archives and had Greek scholars translate Persian texts. He was not just a conqueror, but a collector of knowledge. In 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated, and Alexander, just 20 years old, became king. Within 2 years, he had secured his position in Macedonia and Greece. Then, in 334 BCE, he launched his invasion of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was the largest the world had ever seen. It stretched from Egypt to India, from the Mediterranean to the steppes of Central Asia. It had been the dominant power in the Near East for over 2 centuries. And Alexander, with an army of perhaps 40,000 men, intended to conquer it all. The story of Alexander's conquest is the stuff of legend. In 334 BCE, he crossed into Asia Minor and won his first major victory at the Granicus River. In 333 BCE at Issus, he defeated the Persian king Darius III, despite being outnumbered. He then turned south, conquering the Phoenician cities, and crucially for our story, Egypt. The founding of Alexandria. In 332 BCE, Alexander arrived in Egypt. The Egyptians, who had chafed under Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. He traveled to the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis in the western desert, where the priests declared him the son of Amun, a pharaoh and a god. It was a political masterstroke. Alexander now had divine legitimacy in Egyptian eyes. But Alexander's most lasting contribution to Egypt was the city he founded. on the Mediterranean coast where the Nile Delta met the sea, Alexander chose a site for a new city. It was a brilliant location, protected from the sea by the island of Pharos, connected to the rich agricultural land of the Nile Delta, positioned perfectly for trade between the Mediterranean world and the interior of Africa and Asia. According to legend, Alexander personally marked out the city's boundaries using barley meal. Some sources also say flour. When birds descended and ate the meal, his seers were disturbed, thinking it a bad omen. But one seer reinterpreted the sign. The city would be so prosperous that it would feed many nations. The city would be called Alexandria, one of perhaps 20 cities Alexander founded bearing his name, but the only one that would become truly great. Alexander appointed his trusted companion, Cleomenes, as the overseer of the city's construction, and then departed to continue his conquests. He would never see his city completed. In 331 BCE, he marched east and crushed the Persian army at Gaugamela. In 330 BCE, he captured and looted Persepolis, the Persian capital. He continued east into Central Asia and eventually into India before his exhausted army finally forced him to turn back. In June 323 BCE in Babylon, not yet 33 years old, Alexander fell ill and died. The exact cause remains mysterious. Malaria, typhoid, poisoning, or perhaps the complication of too many wounds and too much wine. His death would shatter his empire into pieces, fought over by his generals, but his city, Alexandria, would rise to become the intellectual capital of the world. When Alexander died without a clear heir, his wife Roxana was pregnant, his half-brother was mentally disabled, and his other wife Statira was also pregnant. His generals immediately began positioning themselves for power. The empire descended into chaos as these successors, or diadochi, fought to carve out kingdoms for themselves. One of these generals was Ptolemy, son of Lagos. Ptolemy had been one of Alexander's closest companions, his bodyguard, and a trusted commander. He was also rumored, though never confirmed, to be Alexander's half-brother, another illegitimate son of Philip II. Ptolemy made a calculated decision. Rather than fighting for control of the entire empire, he would secure Egypt. It was defensible, rich, ancient, and far enough from Macedonia to provide some safety. In 323 BCE, he was appointed satrap, governor of Egypt. In 321 BCE, he made a bold move that would cement his claim. He hijacked Alexander's funeral cortege as it was being transported from Babylon to Macedonia and brought Alexander's body to Egypt, first to Memphis, and later, after Alexandria was more established, to Alexandria itself, where it was displayed in a golden sarcophagus for centuries. This gave Ptolemy tremendous legitimacy. He was the custodian of Alexander's body, the keeper of the great conqueror's legacy. Through the wars of the successors, which would rage until 281 BCE, Ptolemy gradually expanded his control. He seized Cyprus, parts of Asia Minor, and Libya. In 305 BCE, he took the title of Basileus, king. He became Ptolemy I Soter, Ptolemy the Savior. He would rule Egypt for another 20 years, until his death in 283 BCE at the age of 84. Ptolemy was more than a warrior. He was also an intellectual. He wrote a history of Alexander's campaign, now lost, but used as a source by the later historian Arrian. He understood that to rule Egypt, he needed to win the support of both the Greek immigrants who had flooded into Alexandria and the native Egyptian population. He presented himself as a pharaoh to the Egyptians and as a Greek king to the Greeks. He supported both Egyptian temples and Greek institutions. And he had a vision to make Alexandria not just a great city, but the greatest city, a center of learning that would surpass Athens, the intellectual heart of a new world where Greek culture merged with the ancient wisdom of Egypt and the East. Ptolemy I and Demetrius of Phalerum, conceiving the library. The exact date of the Library of Alexandria's founding is lost to history, but most scholars place it around 295 BCE, during the reign of Ptolemy I, though some argue it was his son Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, who truly established the institution. The key figure in the library's creation was a man named Demetrius of Phalerum. Demetrius was an Athenian philosopher, orator, and statesman who had governed Athens from 317 to 307 BCE. He was a student of Aristotle's successor, Theophrastus, and was steeped in the peripatetic philosophical tradition. When he was overthrown and exiled from Athens, he fled to Egypt around 297 BCE and found a welcome patron in Ptolemy I. Demetrius became Ptolemy's advisor, and it was likely his influence that led to the creation of the Museion and its library. The Museion, the museum, or Temple of the Muses, was modeled on Aristotle's Lyceum. It was not a museum in our modern sense, but rather an institution of advanced study. Imagine a combination of modern research university, a library, a botanical garden, a zoo, an astronomical observatory, and a residential college, all in one institution. The Museion was funded directly by the royal treasury. Scholars who were appointed to the Museion received generous stipends. They paid no taxes. They had access to communal meals. They could devote themselves entirely to research and teaching. In return, they were expected to advance knowledge and bring glory to Alexandria and its rulers. The library was the heart of the Museion. The Ptolemies were determined to collect every book in the known world. They sent agents throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, to Athens, to Rhodes, to Pergamon, to Syria, to Babylon, to India, with one mission: buy books. Cost was no object. Ptolemy wrote to all the rulers of the known world asking them to send copies of works by their poets, philosophers, historians, and scientists. But the Ptolemies didn't just wait for books to come to them. They actively, sometimes ruthlessly, acquired texts. Every ship that docked at Alexandria's harbor was searched. If books were found aboard, they were confiscated and taken to the library. There, scribes made copies. Sometimes the original was kept and the copy returned to the ship. Sometimes both were kept. These confiscated books were labeled from the ships to distinguish them from more legitimate acquisitions. The most famous story of Ptolemaic book acquisition involves Ptolemy III, Euergetes. who ruled from 246 to 222 BCE. Athens possessed the official state copies of the works of the three great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These were precious beyond measure, the master copies from which all other copies were made. Ptolemy asked to borrow them so that Alexandrian scribes could make copies. The Athenians, understandably suspicious, demanded an enormous deposit, 15 talents of silver. A single talent was the equivalent of roughly 20 years' wages for a skilled worker, so 15 talents was an astronomical sum, perhaps equivalent to tens of millions of dollars today. Ptolemy paid the deposit, received the manuscripts, had them copied beautifully by the finest scribes, and then kept the originals for the library. He sent the copies back to Athens and forfeited his 15 talents. The Athenians were reportedly furious, but what could they do? Ptolemy had the manuscripts, and the money was already paid. This aggressive acquisition policy, combined with the library's reputation for excellence, meant that within a generation or two, Alexandria possessed the world's greatest collection of written knowledge. The physical library, architecture, and organization. What did the library actually look like? Frustratingly, we have no detailed architectural descriptions from ancient sources, and no archaeological remains have been definitively identified as the library building. We must piece together a picture from scattered references and what we know about other Hellenistic buildings. The library was part of the royal palace complex in the Bruchion, the royal quarter of Alexandria. The Bruchion occupied the eastern part of the city, along the waterfront. It contained the royal palaces, government buildings, the great theater, the tomb of Alexander, gardens, and the museum with its library. The library building itself was likely a large columned structure in the Greek style. It may have had multiple wings or buildings. Some sources refer to an inner and outer library. The inner library may have been the main repository, while the outer library may have been more accessible to scholars or may have housed duplicate copies. Inside, we can imagine long halls lined with shelves, but these were not shelves for books as we knew them. Ancient books were scrolls, rolled manuscripts made from papyrus or parchment. A typical scroll was about 30 feet long when unrolled, though some were much longer. Scrolls were stored in pigeonholes or on shelves, often in wooden or clay containers called capsae. Each container would be labeled with tags identifying its contents. The scrolls themselves were handwritten, of course. Papyrus made from the papyrus plant that grew abundantly in the Nile Delta was the primary writing material. The plant's pith was cut into thin strips, which were laid perpendicular to one another and pressed together. When dried, this created a smooth writing surface. Parchment made from treated animal skin were more expensive but more durable. It was used for especially important texts. The library also contained lecture halls where scholars could teach, private study rooms, dining halls where scholars could take their meals and discuss their works, gardens where they could walk and think, and perhaps astronomical observation platforms. The library's collection was organized, though we're not certain of the exact system. Callimachus of Cyrene, one of the most famous scholars associated with the library, created the Pinaky, or tables or lists, which was essentially the world's first library catalog. The Pinnaces ran to 120 scrolls itself and organized the library's holdings by subject and author. It included biographical information about authors, lists of their work, and even the first lines of text to help distinguish different books with the same title. The main categories in Callimachus' system appears to have been epic poetry, lyric poetry, tragedy, comedy, history, oratory, philosophy, and miscellaneous prose. Within each category, authors were listed alphabetically. This organizational system would influence library science for centuries. How many scrolls did the library contain? Ancient sources give widely varying numbers. The letter of Aristeas, written in the 2nd century BCE, claims 200,000 scrolls with plans to expand to 500,000. Aulus Gellius, writing in the 2nd century CE, says 700,000 scrolls. John Sess, a Byzantine scholar writing in the 12th century CE, long after the library was gone, claims 400,000 mixed books and 90,000 unmixed or single works. Modern scholars are skeptical of these large numbers. Some suggest 40,000 to 100,000 scrolls is more realistic, but we must remember that a single work might require multiple scrolls. Homer's Iliad, for instance, needed 24 scrolls, one for each book, so even 40,000 scrolls might represent far fewer distinct works. Still, even at the most conservative estimates, the Library of Alexandria contained more texts than any other library in the ancient world, and possibly more than all other libraries combined. Let us imagine for a moment what daily life might have been like for a scholar at the Mausoleum. You wake in your private quarters within the palace complex. The Mediterranean sun streams through your window. You wash and dress in your chiton, the simple Greek garment. You walk through gardens filled with exotic plants collected from throughout the known world, specimens sent back by Alexander's expeditions and by subsequent Ptolemaic explorers. Perhaps you pass the zoo, where African elephants, lions, and giraffes are kept. The Ptolemies love to display exotic animals, both to impress visitors and to study them. You arrive at the common dining hall for breakfast. The Mausoleum provides meals to its scholars, simple fare, perhaps bread, olive, cheese, dried fish, watered wine. You eat with your colleagues, perhaps discussing yesterday's debate over whether Homeric poems were originally written or oral, or comparing notes on an eclipse observation, or arguing over a textual variant in a manuscript of Plato. After breakfast, you head to the library. The morning is for research. You've requested several scrolls from the librarian's assistant. They fetch them from the vast collection and bring them to your study area. You're working on a commentary on Herodotus' histories. You're comparing different copies to establish the most accurate text, noting variations, trying to understand what Herodotus meant when he described certain foreign customs. The work is painstaking. There are no quotation marks in ancient texts, no paragraph breaks, no spaces between words. You must parse the continuous streams of letters, deciding where one word ends and another begins. You make notes on separate papyrus sheets, or sometimes in the margins of the text itself if it's a working copy. Around midday, the library quiets. It's time for the communal meal. Again, scholars gather, eat, talk, conversations might turn to politics. There's news that the Seleucid king in Syria is stirring up trouble. Or it might remain purely intellectual. Someone has a new theory about the movements of the planets. The afternoon might be devoted to teaching. More junior scholars or sons of wealthy Alexandrians come to hear lectures. You might give a formal lecture in one of the halls or lead a smaller discussion group in the gardens. You're teaching rhetoric today, using examples from Demosthenes and Lysias, both of whose works are available in multiple copies in the library. Evening comes. Some scholars continue working by lamplight, expensive as oil costs money, but the Mauseon provides a generous allowance. Others walk along the waterfront, watching ships come and go from the great harbor, thinking about problems they're working on. Still others attend performances at the theater or gatherings at wealthy citizens' homes. This is the life that made Alexandria the intellectual center of the world. Scholars had everything they needed: access to nearly all written knowledge, colleagues to debate with, students to teach, time to think and write, and freedom from financial worry. It's no wonder that the greatest minds of the Hellenistic age gravitated to Alexandria. Part 2. The Golden Age of Alexandrian Scholarship. The Library of Alexandria had a succession of directors, called chief librarians, who were often the leading scholars of their age. Let us meet these guardians of knowledge, for they shaped not just the library, but the course of intellectual history. Zenodidus of Ephesus, circa 325 to 260 BCE, was most likely the first head librarian, appointed around 285 BCE by Ptolemy I or his son Ptolemy II. Zenodidus was a grammarian and literary critic. His most important work was creating the first critical edition of Homer's Odyssey and Iliad. He collected different versions of the texts from throughout the Greek world, compared them, tried to establish which readings were original and which were later corruptions, and divided the epics into the 24 books, each that we still use today. This might sound like dry technical work, but it was revolutionary. Zenodidus pioneered the scholarly method of textual criticism, the careful comparison of manuscripts to establish the most accurate version of a text. Every modern scholarly edition of every ancient text uses methods that descend from Zenodidus' work. Apollonius of Rhodes, circa 295 to 215 BCE, succeeded Zenodidus, though his tenure was apparently short and controversial. Apollonius was a poet as well as a scholar. He wrote the Argonautica, an epic poem about Jason and the Argonauts' quest for the Golden Fleece. It's one of the few Hellenistic epics that survives complete. According to ancient sources, Apollonius had a famous feud with another Alexandrian poet, Callimachus, over the proper style of poetry. Callimachus believed in short, refined, polished poems. Apollonius believed in long, traditional epic poetry. They apparently criticized each other's work publicly. Eventually, Apollonius left Alexandria for Rhodes, which is why he's called Apollonius of Rhodes, even though he was born in Alexandria. Later in life, he returned to Alexandria and was reinstated as head librarian. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, circa 276 to 194 BCE, was perhaps the greatest of the library's directors. Ptolemy III Euergetes appointed him around 245 BCE, and he held the position for over 40 years until his death. Eratosthenes was a polymath, a mathematician, geographer, poet, astronomer, and music theorist. His nickname was Beta, the second letter of the Greek alphabet, because he was supposedly second best at everything. But this was actually a compliment. It meant he excelled in multiple fields, even if he wasn't the absolute best in any single one. Another nickname was Pentathlos, after the 5-event athletic competition, again emphasizing his versatility. Eratosthenes' most famous achievement was measuring the circumference of the Earth. He noticed that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun was directly overhead in Syene, in southern Egypt. The sun shone straight down into wells, and vertical objects cast no shadow. But in Alexandria, about 500 miles north, the sun was not directly overhead. It cast shadows at an angle. Eratosthenes measured the angle of the shadow in Alexandria at noon on the summer solstice, about 7.2 degrees, or 1/50th of a circle. He realized that if the sun's rays were parallel, which they effectively are given the sun's distance, then this angle represented the curvature of the Earth between Alexandria and Syene. If 500 miles equals 7.2 degrees, then the full 360-degree circle of the Earth's circumference must be about 25,000 miles. The actual circumference of the Earth is about 24,900 miles. Eratosthenes, using only shadows, geometry, and reasoning, came within about 100 miles of the correct answer, more than 2,000 years before satellites and modern measuring techniques. It's one of the most elegant experiments in the history of science. Eratosthenes also created a map of the known world, one of the first to use a systematic grid of latitude and longitude. He calculated the tilt of the Earth's axis. He created a chronology of Greek history, trying to establish accurate dates for events like the Trojan War. He worked on prime numbers, developing what's still called the sieves of Eratosthenes for finding primes. And he wrote poetry, though none of it survives. According to legend, Eratosthenes became blind in old age and unable to read, chose to starve himself to death. He was about 82 years old, a remarkable age for the ancient world. Aristophanes of Byzantium, circa 257 to 180 BCE, succeeded Eratosthenes. He was another grammarian and literary critic who made fundamental contributions to the study of Greek language and literature. Aristophanes invented the system of Greek accent marks still used today. Before him, Greek was written without accents, making it difficult to know how words should be pronounced, especially for those learning Greek as a second language. He also edited critical editions of Homer, Hesiod, and many other poets. He pioneered the study of Greek dialects and the history of Greek vocabulary, and he created editions of the great Greek playwrights, Aristophanes, his namesake, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, selecting what he considered their best plays. Some scholars believe that we only have the plays we do from these dramatists because Aristophanes selected them for the library's standard editions, and these were the versions that were copied and recopied by later scribes. Aristarchus of Samothrace, circa 220 to 143 BCE, was the last great head librarian of the library's golden age. Another grammarian and Homeric scholar, Aristarchus continued the work of his predecessors in establishing accurate texts of Greek literature. He was said to have written over 800 commentaries and treatises. Aristarchus refined the critical symbols used to mark up texts. He used an obelisk to mark verses he thought were spurious, and a dipple to mark important passages. He invented scholarly apparatus, the notes and annotations that accompany critical editions. He was famous for his scholarly precision and his insistence on letting the text speak for itself rather than imposing outside interpretations. After Aristarchus, the list of known head librarians becomes unclear. The library continued to function, but the Golden Age was waning. Political instability, the decline of Ptolemaic power, and rising competition from other cultural centers, like Pergamum, meant that Alexandria's intellectual dominance was beginning to slip. Beyond the head librarians, countless other scholars worked in Alexandria, each contributing to human knowledge. Let us meet some of them, for their achievements built the foundation of Western science, mathematics, and philosophy. Euclid, around 300 BCE, probably worked in Alexandria during the reign of Ptolemy I, though he may not have been formally part of the Mosaion. Euclid wrote the Elements, a 13-volume textbook on geometry and number theory. The Elements systematically presented all the geometric knowledge of the Greeks, building from simple axioms and postulates to complex proofs. The Elements is one of the most influential textbooks ever written. It was used continuously for over 2,000 years. Even today, the geometry taught in high school is essentially Euclidean geometry. The Elements taught not just geometric facts, but a way of thinking. The axiomatic method, where you start with basic assumptions and build up complex truths through logical deductions. This method influenced mathematics, philosophy, and science for millennia. A famous story, probably apocryphal, says that Ptolemy I asked Euclid if there was an easier way to learn geometry than working through the elements. Euclid supposedly replied, "There is no royal road to geometry," meaning that even a king must learn the same way as everyone else, through hard work and study. Aristarchus of Samos, circa 310 to 230 BCE, was an astronomer and mathematician who proposed one of the most revolutionary ideas of antiquity. The sun, not the earth, was at the center of the cosmos, and the earth rotated on its axis and revolved around the sun. This heliocentric model was shockingly modern. It wouldn't be proposed again until Copernicus in the 16th century CE, over 1,700 years later. But Aristarchus's ideas were not widely accepted in his own time. Most ancient astronomers rejected heliocentrism because it seemed contrary to common sense and observation. If the Earth is moving, why don't we feel it? Why don't we see stellar parallax, the apparent shift in star positions as the Earth moves? Aristarchus answered that the stars are so far away that the parallax is too small to detect with naked eyes. He was right, but his contemporaries found this explanation unsatisfying. The geocentric model proposed by Ptolemy, no relation to the Ptolemaic Dynasty, in the 2nd century CE became the standard, and the heliocentrism had to wait for Copernicus to be revived. Aristarchus also attempted to measure the distance to the sun and the moon, and to calculate their sizes. His method was geometrically sound, but his measurements were imprecise, leading to underestimations. Still, the attempt was remarkable. Using only geometry and naked eye's observation, he tried to measure the cosmos. Archimedes, circa 287 to 212 BCE, was from Syracuse in Sicily, not Alexandria, but he studied in Alexandria in his youth and corresponded with Alexandrian scholars throughout his life. He was perhaps the greatest mathematician and engineer of antiquity. Archimedes' mathematical achievements include calculating an accurate approximation of pi, discovering the formulas for the surface area and volume of a sphere, proving the law of the lever, and essentially inventing integral calculus, though it wouldn't be fully developed until Newton and Leibniz nearly 2,000 years later. As an engineer, Archimedes designed ingenious war machines that defended Syracuse from Roman attack. He created the Archimedes screw, still used today for pumping water. According to legend, he designed a system of mirrors that focused sunlight to burn enemy ships, though this is probably a myth. The most famous Archimedes story is of him discovering the principle of buoyancy, that an object in water displaces its weight in water while taking a bath. Supposedly, he jumped out of the bath and ran naked through the streets of Syracuse shouting, "Eureka! I have found it." The story is almost certainly apocryphal, but it captures something true about Archimedes, his pure excitement at understanding how the world works. Archimedes died when Syracuse fell to the Romans in 212 BCE. According to various accounts, he was killed by a Roman soldier, either because he was too absorbed in a mathematical problem that he ignored the soldier's orders, or because the soldier didn't recognize him. The Roman general Marcellus, who admired Archimedes, was reportedly angry at his death. Apollonius of Perga, circa 240 to 190 BCE, worked in Alexandria and wrote on mathematics and astronomy. His greatest work was the Conics, an 8-volume treatise on conic sections, the curves produced by slicing a cone at different angles, circles, ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas. Apollonius's work seems abstract and purely theoretical, but conic sections turn out to be fundamental to understanding the universe. Planets orbit in ellipses, projectiles follow parabolic paths, hyperbolas describe certain orbital trajectories, the reflectors in flashlights and telescopes are parabolic. Without understanding conic sections, much of physics and engineering would be impossible. Apollonius couldn't have known how important his work would become. Eusebius, circa 285 to 222 BCE, was an inventor and mathematician who worked in Alexandria. He is considered the father of pneumatics, the study of air pressure and its applications. Eusebius invented the water clock, which used a steady flow of water to measure time much more accurately than previous timekeeping methods. He invented the hydraulis, a keyboard instrument powered by water pressure, essentially the first pipe organ. He created various water pumps, fire engines, and mechanical toys. Eusebius' student, Hero of Alexandria, circa 10 to 70 CE, continued this tradition of mechanical invention. Hero wrote treatises on mathematics, mechanics, and pneumatics. He invented a primitive steam engine called an aeolipile, though it was used only as a novelty, not as a source of power. He created automatic opening temple doors, vending machines that dispensed holy water for a coin, and countless other clever devices. Hero's inventions were so advanced that when his writings were rediscovered in the Renaissance, some scholars initially thought they must be frauds. Surely the ancients couldn't have built such sophisticated machines. Hipparchus, circa 190 to 120 BCE, was an astronomer and mathematician, possibly born in Nicaea but who worked in Alexandria and Rhodes. He is considered the greatest observational astronomer of antiquity. Hipparchus created the first comprehensive star catalog, listing the positions and brightnesses of about 850 stars. He discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that caused the position of the stars to shift slightly over centuries. He refined astronomical measurements, developed trigonometry, particularly spherical trigonometry, essential for astronomy, and created geometric models of the sun and moon's motions that were remarkably accurate. Hipparchus's work was so good that it was used for centuries. Ptolemy's later astronomical system, the Ptolemaic system, proposed around 150 CE, was built largely on Hipparchus's observations and methods. Claudius Ptolemy, circa 100 to 170 CE, worked in Alexandria several centuries after the library's founding, during the Roman rule. We don't know if he was formally connected to the library or its successor institutions, but he clearly had access to Alexandria's scholarly resources. Ptolemy wrote works on astronomy, geography, mathematics, optics, and astrology that would dominate their fields for over a millennia. His Almagest, from the Arabic al-Majisti, meaning the greatest, was the definitive astronomical textbook for over 1,400 years. It presented a mathematical model of the cosmos, with Earth at the center, surrounded by spheres carrying the moon, sun, planets, and stars. The system was mathematically sophisticated, using epicycles, circles within circles, and other geometric devices to explain the complex motions of the planets. Though we now know the system was wrong in its fundamentals, the Earth does orbit the Sun, not vice versa, it was remarkably accurate for predicting planetary positions and eclipses. Ptolemy's geography was equally influential. It attempted to map the entire known world using a coordinate system of latitude and longitude. Ptolemy's map included Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, India, and parts of Southeast Asia and China. His estimates of distances were often wrong. He significantly underestimated the circumference of the Earth, which would later encourage Christopher Columbus to think he could reach Asia by sailing west. But his systemic approach to cartography was revolutionary. Galen, 129 circa 216 CE, was a physician and medical writer who studied in Alexandria around 150 CE. He became the most important medical authority in both the Western and Islamic worlds for over 1,000 years. Galen performed anatomical dissections on animals as human dissections was forbidden, conducted physiological experiments, and wrote extensively on medicine, anatomy, and philosophy. Galen's access to Alexandria's medical texts, including works by Hippocrates, and the writings of the great Alexandrian anatomists Herophilus and Erasistratus, shaped his thinking. He synthesized earlier medical knowledge into a comprehensive system that explained health, disease, and treatment. Though many of his theories were wrong by modern standards, his observational work and his emphasis on anatomy were important steps towards modern medicine. Hypatia, circa 360 to 415 CE, was a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher who taught in Alexandria in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. She was the daughter of Theon of Alexandria, himself a distinguished mathematician. Hypatia became the head of the Neoplatonic school in Alexandria and was renowned for her learning and teaching. Hypatia wrote commentaries on mathematical works and may have improved the design of the astrolabe and the hydrometer. She taught both pagan and Christian students and was respected by the city's elite, including Roman prefect Orestes. Tragically, Hypatia was murdered in 415 CE by a mob of Christian zealots, possibly incited by Cyril, the Patriarch of Alexandria. The exact circumstances and motivations remain debated, but her death was connected to political and religious conflicts in Alexandria. She was dragged from her chariot, taken to a church, stripped and killed, according to some accounts, flayed with broken pottery shards. Hypatia's murder is often seen as symbolic of the end of classical learning and the decline of Alexandria's intellectual tradition. Though this interpretation is probably too simple, the decline was gradual and had multiple causes. Hypatia remains a powerful symbol of the clash between reason and fanaticism, between classical learning and religious extremism. One of the Library of Alexandria's most important projects was the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, known as the Septuagint. By the 3rd century BCE, Alexandria had a large Jewish community. Many Alexandrian Jews no longer spoke Hebrew fluently. Their everyday language was Greek. There was a need for a Greek version of the Torah, so that Greek-speaking Jews could study their sacred texts. According to the letter of Orestes, a text written in the 2nd century BCE, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, commissioned this translation around 280 BCE. The letter claims that Ptolemy, wanting the Jewish laws for his library, requested that the high priest in Jerusalem send scholars to Alexandria to translate the Hebrew scriptures. 72 Jewish scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, came to Alexandria. They were housed on the island of Pharos and completed the translation in exactly 72 days. The story is probably more legend than history. The number 72 was later rounded to 70, given the translation its name, Septuagint, from the Latin for 70. The translation was probably done gradually over many decades, by multiple translators, for the Jewish community's own needs rather than at royal command. Nevertheless, Septuagint is hugely important. It was the version of the Hebrew Bible used by Greek-speaking Jews, including early Christians. Most Old Testament quotations in the New Testament come from the Septuagint, not the Hebrew original. The Septuagint influenced the development of Christian theology and the transmission of Jewish scripture to the Western world. The Septuagint project also exemplifies Alexandria's cosmopolitan character. Here was a Greek institution, preserving Jewish sacred texts, creating a bridge between cultures. This was the Alexandrian ideal, gathering all knowledge from all peoples, making it accessible, preserving it for future generations. Alexandria was also a center of medical research, particularly in the early Ptolemaic period. Two physicians, Herophilus and Erasistratus, made groundbreaking discoveries in anatomy and physiology. Herophilus, circa 335 to 280 BCE, came from Chalcedon near modern Istanbul to study in Alexandria under Ptolemy I. What made Alexandria unique for medical research was that, unlike elsewhere in the Greek world, human dissection was permitted. Early Greek physicians like Hippocrates had studied anatomy primarily through observation of wounds and animal dissection. But Herophilus was able to dissect human cadavers systematically. Herophilus discovered and described many anatomical structures. He distinguished between arteries and veins. He described the brain in detail, including the ventricles, and argued correctly, though this wouldn't be widely accepted for centuries, that the brain, not the heart, was the seat of intelligence. He described the eye, including the retina. He studied the reproductive system and the liver. He investigated the nervous system and distinguished between sensory and motor nerves. Herophilus also advanced diagnostic medicine. He was the first physician to systematically measure the pulse, recognizing its diagnostic values. He wrote treatises on anatomy, on the pulse, on therapeutics, and on midwifery, all now lost, known only through later references. Erasistratus, circa 304 to 250 BCE, was Herophilus's younger contemporary. He also conducted human dissections and made important anatomical discoveries. Erasistratus studied the heart valves and understood their function. He investigated the brain and noted that humans have more complex brain convolutions than other animals. He explored the distinction between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Erasistratus developed a sophisticated, though ultimately incorrect, theory of physiology based on pneuma, breath or spirit, flowing through the body. He rejected the idea that disease was caused by an imbalance of humors, the dominant theory going back to Hippocrates, and instead focused on anatomical causes. Both physicians faced accusations, recorded by later writers, of performing vivisections on criminals provided by the Ptolemies. The Roman writer Celsus, writing around 30 CE, claimed that Herophilus and Erasistratus dissected living criminals to observe organs in action. Modern scholars debate whether this actually happened. Some argue the accusations were later inventions by opponents of dissections. Others suggest that if it did occur, it was extremely rare and not a regular practice. Whether or not vivisections occurred, the anatomical work of Herophilus and Erasistratus represented a quantum leap in medical knowledge. Unfortunately, after them, human dissection became increasingly restricted due to religious and ethical objections. Medical knowledge stagnated, and many of their discoveries were forgotten or distorted in transmission. It would be over 1,500 years before human anatomy was again studied with similar rigor during the Renaissance. We cannot discuss Alexandria without mentioning one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, or the Pharos. The lighthouse was built on the island of Pharos, in Alexandria's harbor during the reign of Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II around 280 BCE. It was designed by the architect Sostratus of Cnidus. Ancient sources say it took 12 years to build and cost 800 talents, an enormous sum. The lighthouse was a marvel of engineering. It stood between 330 and 450 feet tall. Ancient sources give varying heights, making it one of the tallest structures in the ancient world. It was built in 3 stages: a square base, an octagonal middle section, and a circular top section. At the top was the light itself, probably an open fire burning during the night, with polished metal mirrors to reflect and intensify the light. According to legend, the light could be seen from 35 miles away at sea. Whether this is accurate is debatable. A fire, even reflected, probably couldn't be seen that far, but there's no doubt the lighthouse was visible for many miles, guiding ships safely to Alexandria's harbor. The lighthouse stood for over 1,500 years. It was damaged by earthquakes in 956, 1303, and 1323 CE, each time losing height. Finally, in 1480, the Egyptian Mamluk Sultan Qaybay built a fortress on the site using stones from the collapsed lighthouse. The fortress still stands today. In the 1990s, French archaeologists discovered remains of the lighthouse underwater near the site. They found large stone blocks, statues, and columns, remnants of one of antiquity's greatest architectural achievements. The Pharaoh's lighthouse became so famous that its name entered multiple languages as the word for lighthouse: Pharaoh in Italian and Spanish, Pharaoh in French, Pharaoh in Portuguese. The lighthouse symbolizes Alexandria's golden age: innovative engineering, monumental scale, practical purpose combined with beauty, and the desire to be a beacon, literally, for the world. The Mausoleum complex included extensive gardens and a zoo, reflecting the Ptolemies' interest in natural history. These were not merely for decorations or entertainment, they were research facilities. Alexander the Great had sent back specimens from his conquests, plants, animals, minerals, to his former tutor Aristotle, who used them in his biological research. The Ptolemies continued this tradition. Ptolemaic explorers and traders brought back exotic species from Africa, India, and beyond. The zoo housed elephants, lions, leopards, giraffes, rhinoceros, bears, and many other animals. These creatures were studied by scholars interested in natural history. Some animals were also used in royal processions. Ptolemy II Philadelphus held a spectacular procession in which elephants, leopards, ostriches, and other exotic animals were displayed to dazzle Alexandrians and foreign visitors. The gardens contained plants from throughout the known world. Medicinal herbs were grown for study and use. Scholars could observe plant growth, study botanical structures, and experiment with cultivation techniques. The work done in these gardens contributed to ancient botany and pharmacology. Theophrastus, Aristotle's successor and the founder of botany as a science, corresponded with Alexandrian scholars and may have relied on information from Alexandria's gardens. His works on plants describe hundreds of species, including many that were not native to Greece. This integration of library, museum, gardens, and zoo reflects a holistic approach to knowledge. Text-based learning was combined with observation and experiment. The written works in the library informed field observations, and observations in turn led to new texts being written. It was an early form of the interdisciplinary research university that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. Part 3. The political context, empire, dynasty, and decline. To understand the library's fate, we must understand the political history of Ptolemaic Egypt. The library did not exist in isolation. Its fortunes rose and fell with the dynasty that created it. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, from 305 BCE to 30 BCE. They were Greeks ruling a land with a 5,000-year-old civilization. This created a complex cultural dynamic. The Ptolemies presented themselves to the native Egyptians as pharaohs, participating in traditional Egyptian religious ceremonies, building and restoring temples, supporting the Egyptian priesthood, but they also maintained Greek culture and language in Alexandria and other Greek cities in Egypt. Egypt effectively became a dual society, a Greek-speaking elite in the cities, especially Alexandria, and an Egyptian-speaking majority in the countryside. The early Ptolemies, Ptolemy I, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, Ptolemy III Euergetes, were strong rulers who expanded the kingdom and enriched it. Ptolemy II, in particular, was known for his cultural patronage. He expanded the library, supported poets and scholars, and held magnificent festivals. His reign, 283 to 246 BCE, was a golden age for Alexandria. But dynasty has inherent problems. Questions of succession, sibling rivalries, and inbreeding. The Ptolemies adopted the Egyptian practice of royal siblings marrying each other, gradually weakened the dynasty. By the 2nd century BCE, the Ptolemaic kingdom faced increasing internal instability. Native Egyptians' revolts challenged Greek rule. Royal family members fought civil wars against each other. The kingdom's military and economic power declined, and a new threat was rising: Rome. In 2000 BCE, Rome was still largely confined to Italy and parts of Spain and North Africa. By 100 BCE, Rome controlled the entire Mediterranean basin. The Hellenistic kingdoms, Macedonia, Syria, Pergamum, Egypt, fell one by one under Roman domination, either conquered outright or reduced to client states. The Ptolemies tried to navigate this dangerous new world through diplomacy. They allied with Rome against common enemies. They sent embassies laden with gifts. They played Roman factions against each other, but it was a losing game. Rome was too powerful, Egypt too weak and divided. In 168 BCE, an incident showed how much power dynamics had shifted. The Seleucid king, Antiochus IV, invaded Egypt, threatening to conquer it. Ptolemy VI appealed to Rome for help. Rome sent a single ambassador, Gaius Popilius Laenas. Laenas met Antiochus outside Alexandria, delivered a Roman Senate decree, ordering him to withdraw, and when Antiochus said he needed to consult his advisors, Laenas drew a circle in the sand around the king and said, "Before you step out of this circle, give me a reply to lay before the Senate." Antiochus, facing the imminent threat of war with Rome, backed down. Egypt was saved, but at the price of becoming effectively a Roman protectorate. The Ptolemies now ruled at Rome's sufferance. Internal decay accelerated. Ptolemy VIII, fisc in 170 to 116 BCE, was a brutal ruler who massacred intellectuals and drove many scholars from Alexandria, scattering them to other cities. The library suffered a brain drain. Pergamum, Rhodes, and other cities became rival intellectual centers. The last Ptolemies were weak rulers, many of them manipulated by advisors or incompetent adults embroiled in civil war. Egypt was kept independent not by its own strength, but because Roman factions couldn't agree on which of them should annex it. Then came Cleopatra VII, one of history's most famous women, the last truly powerful Ptolemaic ruler. Cleopatra became queen in 51 BCE at age 18, co-ruling with her young brother husband Ptolemy XIII. The Ptolemies practiced sibling marriage. She was intelligent, educated, politically astute, and desperate to preserve Egyptian independence. Crucially for our story, Cleopatra was the first Ptolemaic ruler in nearly 3 centuries who bothered to learn Egyptian. Her predecessors had ruled Egypt while speaking only Greek. Cleopatra spoke Egyptian, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic, and several other languages. Ancient sources say she could converse with ambassadors from many nations without a translator. This linguistics ability suggests she was a serious scholar who likely used the library's resources. Cleopatra's reign coincided with Rome's collapse into civil war. Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus had formed a triumvirate to control Rome, but it fell apart. Caesar and Pompey went to war. In 48 BCE, Pompey fled to Egypt after Caesar defeated him at Pharsalus. The Egyptians, trying to curry favor with Caesar, murdered Pompey as he came ashore. Caesar arrived in Egypt in pursuit of Pompey. He brought only a small force, 3,200 infantry and 800 cavalry, but he was still Rome's most powerful general. Egypt was in the midst of a civil war between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. Caesar installed himself in the royal palace in Alexandria and summoned both rulers. Cleopatra famously had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence, supposedly rolled up in a carpet or bedding. She became Caesar's lover and ally. Caesar backed Cleopatra against her brother. This triggered the Alexandrian War, 48 to 47 BCE. Ptolemy XIII's forces besieged Caesar and Cleopatra in the palace quarter of Alexandria. It was during this conflict that Caesar ordered the burning of the Egyptian fleet in the harbor, an act that may have destroyed part of the library's collection. Let us examine this crucial moment, for it may be when the Library of Alexandria first suffered catastrophic damage. The ancient sources are frustratingly unclear. Caesar was trapped in Alexandria with a small force, facing a much larger Egyptian army. His situation was precarious. He held the royal palace and the adjacent area, including the harbor, but he was outnumbered and cut off from reinforcements. The Egyptian fleet in the harbor posed a serious threat. If it fell into the hands of Caesar's enemies, they could block relief from the sea and attack Caesar's position from the water. Caesar made a bold decision. He would burn the fleet. Plutarch, in his Life of Caesar, written about 150 years after the events, say when the enemy tried to cut off his fleet, he was forced to repel the danger by using fire, and this spread from the dockyard and destroyed the great library. Cassius Dio, writing in the early 3rd century CE, some 250 years after the event, also mentions fire spreading from the docks and says that storehouses containing books were burned. Seneca the Younger, writing in the 1st century CE, about a century after the fire, mentions that 40,000 books were burned in Alexandria. But here's where things get complicated. Other sources that describe Caesar's Alexandrian campaign, including Caesar's own account in his commentaries on the Civil War, don't mention the library being damaged. The Greek geographer Strabo visited Alexandria around 20 BCE, just a few decades after Caesar's fire, and described the Mausoleum as a functioning institution with no hint that it had been destroyed. So what actually happened? Modern scholars propose several scenarios. Scenario 1. The main library was destroyed. Perhaps Plutarch and the others were right, and the great library in the Bruchion was burned. Strabo didn't mention it because it was too painful, or because he assumed everyone knew, or because by library he meant the institution rather than the building. This scenario suggests the library was rebuilt or relocated after 48 BCE. Scenario 2. Warehouses were destroyed. Perhaps what burned were not the main library, but the warehouses near the docks where scrolls awaiting exports or imports were stored. These might have been books intended for trade or shipping, or duplicate copies. The loss would have been significant but not catastrophic. The main library in the palace, quarter away from the harbor, survived intact. Scenario 3. Part of the collection was lost. Perhaps the fire spread from the docks to parts of the palace quarter, damaging some library buildings but not others. The Mausoleum complex may have been large enough that some sections burned while others survived. Scenario 4. The numbers are exaggerated. Perhaps some books were lost, but later writers exaggerated the damage. 40,000 scrolls sounds like a lot, but if the library held hundreds of thousands, it might have been a serious but not fatal loss. The truth is, we simply don't know for certain. The balance of evidence suggests that something was lost in 48 BCE, but the main library probably survived, perhaps damaged and diminished, but still functioning. The Golden Age was over, but the library lived on. After Caesar's death in 44 BCE, Cleopatra allied with Mark Antony, one of Caesar's supporters who controlled Rome's eastern territories. Antony and Cleopatra became lovers, and Antony essentially became Cleopatra's consort, helping her rule Egypt while pursuing his own ambitions against Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, Caesar's heir and Antony's rival. A story from this period relates to the library. According to Plutarch, Antony gave Cleopatra the entire library of Pergamum, some 200,000 scrolls, as a gift. This would have been an astonishing gesture, and, if true, it would have replenished and even expanded the Alexandrian collection after any losses from Caesar's fire. But many modern scholars are skeptical of this story. It appears in no source earlier than Plutarch, who wrote over a century after the alleged event. It may be Roman propaganda meant to portray Antony as dissolute and corrupted by Cleopatra, stealing from one city to lavish gifts on his foreign lover. Pergamum was an important Hellenistic city in Asia Minor, modern Turkey, with a great library of its own, second only to Alexandria. According to tradition, Pergamum had pioneered the use of parchment, Pergamena, named after the city, when the Ptolemies, jealous of Pergamum's growing library, cut off papyrus export to prevent the rival collection from growing. Whether Antony actually gave the Pergamum library to Cleopatra remains uncertain. If he did, it would suggest the Alexandrian library needed replenishment. supporting the idea that Caesar's fire had caused significant damage. If he didn't, it's just another legend attached to the library's mysterious fate. Antony and Cleopatra's story ended in tragedy. Their forces were defeated by Octavian at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. They fled to Egypt, but Octavian pursued. In 30 BCE, as Octavian's forces closed in on Alexandria, first Antony, then Cleopatra committed suicide. With Cleopatra's death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt became a Roman province, but a special one. It was the personal property of the emperor, administered by a prefect rather than a senator. Egypt's grain fed Rome. Egypt's wealth filled the imperial treasury, but Egypt was no longer independent. What happened to the library? It apparently continued, now under Roman oversight. Augustus, as Octavian was now called, valued Greek culture. He wouldn't have deliberately destroyed the library, but imperial patronage was not the same as royal patronage. The Mausoleum had been a royal institution, funded from the pharaoh's personal treasury. Now it was just another provincial institution, competing for imperial attention and funding with many other priorities. The library probably continued to function through the 1st century CE and into the 2nd. Scholars still worked in Alexandria. New texts were added, but the sense of glory of being at the center of the intellectual world was fading. Part 4. The Mystery Deepens, Destruction, and Disappearance. By the late 1st century CE, references to the main library in the Bruchion became scarce. Instead, sources mentioned the library in the temple of Serapis, the Serapeum. Serapis was a syncretic god, created or promoted by Ptolemy I to unite Greek and Egyptian religious traditions. Serapis combined elements of Greek gods, Zeus, Dionysus, Hades, with Egyptian gods, Osiris, Apis. The result was a deity acceptable to both Greeks and Egyptians, helping to unite the two populations. The cult of Serapis became very popular in the Hellenistic world. The Serapeum temple in Alexandria was magnificent. It stood on a hill, the Acropolis of Alexandria, actually a mound of accumulated debris from an earlier settlements, in the southwest part of the city, reached by 100 steps. Ancient writers described it as one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. According to some sources, a daughter library was established at the Serapeum, perhaps in the 2nd or 1st century BCE. This may have been an overflow facility for the main library, or a replacement after damage from Caesar's fire, or a separate collection focused on religious and philosophical texts. Ancient sources are vague about when and why the Serapeum Library was founded and what its relationship was to the original library. By the 3rd century CE, the Serapeum Library may have been the primary repository of Alexandria's collection, perhaps after the original library in the Bruchion declined or was destroyed. But even this is uncertain. We're dealing with fragmentary evidence and centuries of confusion among ancient sources. The 3rd century CE was a disaster for the Roman Empire. It's called the crisis of the 3rd century, and it nearly destroyed the empire entirely. Between 235 and 284 CE, the empire had over 20 emperors, most of whom died violently. Civil wars raged constantly. The frontiers collapsed under barbarian invasions. Plague swept through the empire. The economy spiraled into hyperinflation. Armies marched back and forth across the empire, leaving devastation in their wake. Egypt and Alexandria suffered terribly during this crisis. In 272 CE, the Emperor Aurelian besieged and captured Alexandria while suppressing a separatist movement. The city was sacked. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the late 4th century, says that the Bruchion, the royal quarter where the original library stood, was destroyed during Aurelian's siege. If the original library still existed in the Bruchion in 272 CE, it was probably destroyed then, but most scholars think it was already long gone by that point, having declined through neglect, dispersal, and perhaps earlier damage. After Aurelian's reconquest, Alexandria rebuilt, but it was not the same city. The palace quarter remained largely in ruins. The library, if any institution could still be called that, was probably reduced to the Serapeum collection. While Alexandria slowly recovered from the 3rd century crisis, a religious revolution was transforming the Roman world. Christianity, a minor persecuted sect in the 1st and 2nd centuries, grew rapidly in the 3rd century despite periodic persecutions. By the early 4th century, Christians may have been a majority in the Eastern Empire. In 313 CE, the Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance to Christians. Constantine himself converted, or claimed to convert. The sincerity of his conversion is debated. He favored Christianity, funded church construction, and involved himself in theological disputes. By the late 4th century, under Emperors Gratian, Valentinian II, and especially Theodosius I, Christianity became not just tolerated, but mandatory. Pagan sacrifices were banned. Pagan temples were ordered closed or destroyed. Traditional Roman religion, which had existed for over 1,000 years, was outlawed. This religious revolution affected Alexandria profoundly. Alexandria had a large Christian population by the 3rd century. It was one of the major centers of early Christianity, home to famous theologians like Clement of Alexandria and Origen, but Alexandria also had a significant pagan population, including many intellectuals for whom the ancient Greek philosophical and religious traditions were central to their identity. The Serapeum, as a major pagan temple, became a flashpoint in these conflicts. In 391 CE, the Christian Emperor Theodosius I issued decrees against pagan worship. In Alexandria, the Patriarch Theophilus led a campaign to destroy pagan temples and convert them to Christian use. The events are described by several contemporary or near-contemporary historians, though their accounts differ in details and interpretation. According to Socrates Galaticus, a 5th century church historian, Theophilus obtained permission from the emperor to demolish pagan temples. He began converting temples into churches and exposing pagan cult practices to ridicule. When he exposed the rituals of the Mithraeum, a temple to the god Mithras, pagans were outraged. Fighting broke out between pagans and Christians. Pagans led by the philosopher Olympius seized the Serapeum and barricaded themselves inside. They took Christian prisoners and, according to Christian sources, tortured and killed some of them. The siege lasted for some time. Eventually, the emperor sent word that the pagan defenders would be pardoned if they surrendered, but the Serapeum itself would be destroyed. The pagans evacuated. Christian mobs led by Theophilus demolished the temple. The great statue of Serapis was destroyed. Christian sources describe this as a victory over demonic idolatry. Pagan sources, where they exist, describe it as a cultural destruction and religious persecution. But here's the crucial question. What happened to the library? None of the contemporary accounts of the Serapeum's destruction mention a library being burned. Socrates Galacticus doesn't mention it. Sozomen, another 5th century church historian who describes the event, doesn't mention it. Rufinus of Aquileia, a Christian writer, who was actually in Alexandria shortly after the destruction and visited the site, describes the destruction of the temple, but says nothing about the books being burned. The Christian writer Orosius, writing around 417 CE, about 26 years after the event, mentioned seeing empty shelves in what had been the Serapeum library. He writes that local Christians told him the library had been emptied by our own men, but he doesn't say when this happened, whether during the destruction in 391 or earlier. This has led to 3 main interpretations. Interpretation 1. The library was destroyed in 391. Some modern historians believe the library was destroyed when the Serapeum was demolished, and the ancient writers simply didn't think it was important enough to mention amid the drama of the temple's destruction. After all, to Christian writers of the time, the important thing was the destruction of a pagan idol and the triumph of Christianity, not the fate of some old books. Interpretation 2. The library was already gone. Other historians believe the Serapeum library had already declined or been dispersed by 391. Perhaps its collection had been gradually sold off, deteriorated, or stolen over the preceding centuries. When the Serapeum was destroyed, there may have been little or nothing left to burn. Orosius's empty shelves support this view. Interpretation 3. The collection was saved. A third possibility is that when it became clear the Serapeum would be destroyed, scholars removed the scrolls to save them. Perhaps they were taken to private collections, to churches, to other libraries, or to monasteries. This might explain why no sources mention books being burned, because they weren't. We simply don't know. The destruction of the Serapeum marks a symbolic end to classical paganism in Alexandria. But whether it also marked the end of the library remains one of history's most frustrating mysteries. 24 years after the Serapeum's destruction, another tragedy occurred that seemed to mark the final end of Alexandria's classical tradition. In 415 CE, Hypatia, the renowned mathematician and philosopher we met earlier, was murdered by a mob of Christian zealots. The circumstances are described by several ancient sources. Hypatia was the daughter of Theon, a mathematician and astronomer who worked in Alexandria in the late 4th century. She succeeded him as the head of the Neoplatonic school in Alexandria. Neoplatonism was a philosophical movement that tried to synthesize Plato's philosophy with mysticism and theology. It was the last great philosophical school of antiquity. Hypatia was famous for her learning. She taught philosophy and mathematics to students from across the Mediterranean. She wrote commentaries on mathematical works and possibly on astronomical texts. She was respected by both pagans and Christians. Some of her students were Christians. She was also influential in Alexandria's politics. She was a friend and advisor to Aristus, the Roman prefect of Alexandria. This brought her into conflict with Cyril, the patriarch of Alexandria. Cyril and Aristus were engaged in a power struggle over control of the city. Cyril wanted the church to have supreme authority. Aristus wanted to maintain secular government control. Their conflict escalated to violence, with riots between Jews and Christians, and between Christians in the government forces. In March 415 CE, during Lent, Hypatia was traveling through Alexandria in her chariot when she was attacked by a mob led by a church lector named Peter. They dragged her to a church, stripped her, and killed her. Accounts say they used broken pottery shards or tiles to flay her flesh from her bone. They then tore her body apart and burned the pieces. The exact motivation for her murder is debated. Some sources suggest Cyril incited the mob because he saw Hypatia as an obstacle to his power as Aristus' advisor. Other sources suggest the mob acted on their own, motivated by religious fanaticism and seeing Hypatia as a symbol of pagan learning. Some modern scholars suggest her murder was primarily political rather than religious, though the two were deeply intertwined in this period. Whatever the exact cause, Hypatia's murder had a chilling effect on intellectual life in Alexandria. Philosophers and scholars felt less safe. Some left the city. The Neoplatonic school continued for a while, but never recovered its former glory. Hypatia's death is often portrayed as symbolic of the end of classical learning and the beginning of the Dark Ages, though this narrative is oversimplified. Learning continued, but it became increasingly centered in Christian institutions, monasteries, and church schools, rather than in secular philosophical schools. And much classical learning was indeed lost or suppressed, particularly texts that were seen as promoting paganism or contradicting Christian doctrines. We now come to the third great theory about the library's destruction, the Arab conquest of Alexandria in 642 CE. By the early 7th century CE, the Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, was exhausted. Decades of war with Persia had drained its resources. In 610 CE, a new emperor, Heraclius, took the throne and eventually defeated Persia, but the victory came at an enormous cost. Into this power vacuum came a new force, Islam. The Prophet Muhammad had unified the Arabian Peninsula, and after his death in 632 CE, his successor, the Caliphs, launched conquests that would create one of history's largest empires in astonishingly short time. In 639 CE, the Arab general Amr ibn al-As invaded Egypt with an army of about 4,000 men, later reinforced. Egypt's defenses were weak. Its population was divided by religious disputes. The Coptic Christians of Egypt followed a different theology than the Greek Orthodox Christians who controlled the Byzantine government, and many Egyptians had no love for Byzantine rule. By 641 CE, Amr had conquered most of Egypt. In 642 CE, Alexandria itself fell after a siege. It was the end of over 900 years of Greek rule in Egypt, dating back to Alexander the Great himself. Now we come to the story that has captured the popular imagination for centuries. According to this tale, after conquering Alexandria, Amr ibn al-As found the city's libraries filled with books. he wrote to the Caliph Umar asking what to do with them. Umar supposedly replied, "As for the books you mentioned, if they are in agreement with the Quran, we have no need of them, as the Quran suffices. If they disagree with the Quran, they are pernicious and should be destroyed." Following these orders, so the story goes, the books were distributed to Alexandria's bathhouses, where they were used as fuel for the furnaces that heated the water. There were so many books that they provided fuel for 6 months. It's a dramatic story that has been repeated countless times, but modern historians, both Western and Muslim, almost universally reject it as false. Let us examine why. The story appears nowhere in early sources. We have multiple Arab historians and geographers writing about the conquest of Egypt in the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th century. None of them mention this story. The earliest appearance of the tale is in the works of 2 writers in the 12th and 13th century. Ibn al-Kifti, writing around 1227, and Bar Hebraeus, writing in the 1280s. That's roughly 600 years after the alleged event. The story contradicts what we know about early Islamic attitudes towards learning. The Quran encourages the pursuit of knowledge. The Hadith saying attributed to Muhammad include "seek knowledge even as far as China," and "the ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr." The early caliphs, particularly the Abbasids, who came to power in the 8th century, were great patrons of learning. They established the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, where scholars translated Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Syriac texts into Arabic, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Contemporary accounts of the conquest make no mention of such a dramatic book burning. Multiple sources describe the Arab conquest of Alexandria. None mention the library or mass book burning. Surely such a spectacular event, burning books for 6 months, would have been noteworthy enough to mention. The story first appears during the Crusades. Ibn al-Kifti wrote during the era of the Crusades, when Christians and Muslim powers were locked in bitter conflict. There was strong motivation on both sides to portray the other as barbarians and destroyers of culture. The story of Umar burning the library fits too neatly into anti-Muslim propaganda narratives. The library probably didn't exist anymore by 642 CE. As we've discussed, the main library likely disappeared centuries earlier, possibly in the 3rd century during the Aurelian siege. The Serapeum library was probably gone by 391 CE, or at least had declined to insignificance. If any institutional library existed in Alexandria in 642 CE, it would have been a Christian institution, and there's no particular reason Arab conquerors would have treated Christian libraries differently than they treated Christian churches. They generally allowed them to continue functioning, though sometimes converting them into mosques. The logistical details don't make sense. Burning papyrus and parchment in bathhouse furnaces is actually not very efficient. These materials burn too quickly to provide sustained heat. Wood or charcoal is much better. And could the story's numbers possibly be accurate? 6 months of fuel for all of Alexandria's bathhouses would require an enormous quantity of material. Even if the library had 400,000 scrolls, the highest ancient estimate, it's hard to see how this would fuel multiple bathhouses for 6 months. So where did the story come from? Probably a combination of factors: anti-Muslim sentiment during the Crusades, a natural desire to have a dramatic explanation for the library's loss, confusion with earlier events, perhaps mixing up the Arab conquest with earlier destructions, and the general tendency of stories to become more elaborate and dramatic over time. The story has had remarkable staying power. It was repeated by Edward Gibbon in his famous Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in the 18th century, giving it scholarly credibility. It's still sometimes presented as fact in popular accounts, but the historical evidence overwhelmingly suggests it never happened. The real story, that the library declined gradually through neglect, disaster, and changing priorities over centuries, is less dramatic, but far more likely. Between the destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE and the Arab conquest in 642 CE, Alexandria remained a major city, though it never recovered its former glory as the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean. During this period, learning in Alexandria became increasingly centered in Christian institutions. The catechetical school of Alexandria, founded in the 2nd century CE, became one of the most important centers of Christian theology and biblical scholarship. Famous theologians like Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and Athanasius studied or taught there. Christian scholars preserved and studied some classical texts, particularly those useful for theology and biblical interpretation: Greek philosophy, rhetoric, grammar, and logic. But other texts were neglected or actively suppressed. Works promoting pagan religion, certain philosophical teachings seen as contrary to Christian doctrine, erotic poetry, and theatrical works were particularly vulnerable. The great classical libraries were replaced by monastic libraries and church libraries. These were much smaller and more selective in their collections. A large monastic library might have a few hundred codices, books in the modern sense, with bound pages which gradually replaced scrolls during this period. This was nothing compared to the hundreds of thousands of scrolls that Alexandria had held at its height. Yet learning did not entirely die. Greek remained the language of education and literature in the Eastern Empire. Grammar schools taught students to read Homer and other classical authors. Scholars continued to write commentaries on ancient texts. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge was preserved and transmitted. When Arab armies conquered Alexandria, they found a city still culturally rich, but no longer the intellectual powerhouse it had been. The conquest marked the end of Greek dominance, but not the end of Alexandrian learning. Under the Arab rule, Alexandria remained an important city, though now it was Cairo, founded in 969 CE, that became Egypt's capital and intellectual center. Part 5. What was lost and why it matters. Let us pause now and contemplate what was lost when the Library of Alexandria, through whatever combination of disasters, disappeared. We can only estimate what the library contained by looking at what survived and trying to imagine what didn't. It's like trying to reconstruct a vast library by examining the few scattered books that remained after a fire, and knowing that what survived was largely random, or worse, not random at all, but reflecting the biases of those who chose what to preserve. Greek literature. We have 7 complete tragedies by Aeschylus. Ancient sources tell us he wrote between 70 and 90 plays. We have 7 complete plays by Sophocles. He wrote approximately 123. We have 19 plays by Euripides, including one of uncertain authorship. He wrote about 92. So from the 3 greatest tragedians of ancient Greece, we have about 7 to 8% of their output. The situation is similar for other genres. Of Greek lyric poetry, the works of Sappho, Alcaeus, Anacreon, and many others, we mostly have fragments, scrapes of papyrus, or quotations in later works. Sappho, called the 10th muse by Plato, was considered among the greatest poets of antiquity. Virtually all her work is lost. We have one complete poem, the Ode to Aphrodite, and numerous fragments, some just a few words. Of Greek comedy, we have 11 complete plays by Aristophanes, from about 40 he wrote, and substantial portions of 8 plays by Menander, from over 100 he wrote. The rest of Greek comedy, hundreds of plays by dozens of playwrights, is gone. Greek philosophy. We have none of the original writings of Socrates, he wrote nothing, and all our knowledge of his teaching comes through Plato, Xenophon, and other students. Of the pre-Socratic philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Democritus, and others who laid the foundation of Western philosophy and science, we only have fragments, quotations, and descriptions in later works. Their actual texts are lost. Aristotle wrote 2 types of works: polished dialogues intended for publication, now all lost, and lecture notes or working texts for his students, which have survived. This means the elegant, accessible Aristotle that ancient readers knew is gone forever, and we only have his more technical, sometimes difficult working notes. Many philosophical schools left almost no trace. The Epicurean, for instance, wrote extensively, but we have only one complete text by Epicurus himself, his letter to Menocius. In the philosophical poem De Rerum Natura by the Roman poet Lucretius, the rest of the vast Epicurean literature is lost. Scientific and mathematical works. Archimedes wrote at least 9 major treatises on mathematics and physics. We have 7, and one of those, the Method, was only rediscovered in 1906 when a medieval prayer book was found to have been written over an earlier manuscript containing Archimedes' text. Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed heliocentrism, wrote a work called On the Sizes and Distances of the Sun and Moon, of which we have a summary. His work proposing that Earth orbits the Sun is lost entirely. We know about it only from references in other sources. The Pythagoreans were said to have made major discoveries in mathematics and mystical philosophy, but their works are almost entirely lost. We know about Pythagorean ideas primarily through hostile descriptions by critics and brief references in later writers. Medical works are similarly devastated. The Alexandrian anatomists, Herophilus and Erasistratus, wrote extensively. All of their original works are lost. We know about their discoveries only through quotations and descriptions by Galen and other medical writers. Historical works. The historian Livy wrote a massive history of Rome from its founding to his own time, 142 books in total. We have 35. The rest are known only through summaries and epitomes written in the 4th century CE. Even worse, we have only fragments of many important historians. Manetho, an Egyptian priest who wrote a history of Egypt in Greek in the 3rd century BCE, would be invaluable for understanding Egyptian chronology. His work survives only in quotations and summaries by later Christian writers who are using him to try to reconcile Egyptian chronology with biblical chronology. Geographic and ethnographic works. Ancient travelers and geographers wrote descriptions of far-off lands. Most are lost. We have Herodotus' histories, which includes extensive geographic and ethnographic information. We have most of Strabo's geography, but we've lost the works Hypatia's, Eratosthenes' geography, and countless travel narratives that would have given us detailed knowledge of the ancient world, trade routes, customs, languages, natural resources, and more. Technical manuals and practical knowledge. Lost engineering treatises might have explained how great monuments of the ancient world were built. Lost agricultural manuals might have contained crop varieties and farming techniques now forgotten. Lost musical texts might have explained how ancient Greek music actually sounded. We have only a handful of fragments of actual ancient Greek music. Lost cookbooks might have given us the recipes of ancient cuisine. Alternate versions and variants. Even for texts that survived, we often only have one version, but ancient works existed in multiple versions. The Homeric poems, for instance, had different regional variations before scholars like Xenodotus tried to establish a standard text. These alternative versions are lost, and with them our understanding of how oral poetry transitioned to written texts. Non-Greek works. The library didn't contain only Greek texts. Manetho wrote in Greek, but preserved Egyptian traditions. The Septuagint translated Hebrew scripture. There may have been Egyptian, Phoenician, Persian, Indian, and other works, either in original languages or in Greek translations. These would have given us windows into cultures we now know only indirectly through Greek and Roman eyes. The lost context. Perhaps most tragically, we've lost context. Ancient books didn't have prefaces, footnotes, or author biographies in our modern sense. Much information was assumed knowledge. References that would have been clear to contemporary readers are now obscure. Jokes fall flat because we don't understand the context. Allusions are lost. Even when we have a text, we may not fully understand it because we lack the cultural context in which it was written. To understand what was lost, we must understand how texts survive, because survival was neither random nor inevitable. Continuous copying. In an age before printing, text survived only through continuous copying. Papyrus scrolls deteriorated after a few centuries. Parchment lasted longer, but still required care. Every generation or two, texts needed to be recopied or they would be lost. This meant that unpopular texts, texts without champions, texts that seemed irrelevant to current interest, simply weren't copied and vanished. The transition from scroll to codex. In the first few centuries CE, the codex, a book with bounded pages, like modern books, gradually replaced the scroll. This transition was an opportunity for loss. Someone had to decide which texts were worth the effort of transferring from scrolls to codex form. Texts not selected for transfer were doomed. The Christian filter. As Christianity became dominant, Christian scribes in monasteries became the primary copyists of texts. They naturally prioritized Christian texts, scripture, theology, hagiography, church history. They also preserved classical texts useful for Christian education, Greek grammar, rhetoric, certain philosophical works, but they were less interested in pagan religious texts, erotic poetry, works promoting philosophies contrary to Christianity, and theatrical works. This wasn't necessarily deliberate censorship, though sometimes it was. Often, it was simply a matter of priorities. If a monastery's scriptorium could produce, say, 20 codices per year, and there were thousands of texts that could be copied, choices had to be made. Christian texts came first. Useful classical texts came next. Everything else might simply never get copied. The Islamic preservation. The rise of Islam in the 7th and 8th century CE actually helped preserve some classical knowledge. Arab scholars translated Greek works on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy into Arabic. These translations preserved texts that were later lost in the original Greek. When these Arabic translations were translated back into Latin in the 12th and 13th century, they helped spark the European Renaissance. But this preservation was selective. Islamic scholars were interested in practical and philosophical knowledge, science, mathematics, medicine, logic, metaphysics. They were less interested in Greek poetry, drama, and history. So these Arab translations preserved one part of classical knowledge while leaving other parts to die. The Byzantine preservation. The Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire surviving until 1453 CE, kept Greek alive as a literary and educated language. Byzantine scholars copied Greek manuscripts throughout the Middle Ages. But again, they were selective. They copied Christian theology most enthusiastically, then classical texts compatible with Christianity or useful education. They didn't copy everything. Pure chance. Finally, there's pure random chance. A text might survive because one monastery happened to copy it, even if no one else did. Or a text might be lost because the only copies happened to be in a library that burned, or a city that was sacked, or a monastery that was abandoned. The paradox is that the texts we have, Homer, Plato, Aristotle, the Greek tragedians, Roman poets like Virgil and Ovid, survived precisely because they were already considered the classics in late antiquity. They were the texts everyone wanted to read and copy. But this means we have a skewed, unrepresentative sample of ancient literature. We have the bestsellers of the ancient world. We're missing the works that were obscure, or experimental, or controversial, or simply unlucky. It's as if 2,000 years from now, future scholars had only the books that had made the bestsellers list in the 21st century, and all the rest, all the obscure novels, the experimental poetry, the small press publications, the self-published works were gone. They would have a very incomplete picture of 21st century literature. Scholars have tried to estimate what percentage of ancient literature has been lost. These estimates aren't necessarily rough, but they're sobering. For Greek dramas, we have perhaps 5 to 10% of what was written. For Greek lyric and elegiac poetry, perhaps 5% or less. For Greek philosophy, the percentage varies wildly by period and school, but overall we've probably lost 70 to 80% of what was written. For Greek history, we have large portions of some historians, but many others are entirely lost, except for fragments. Overall, perhaps 20 to 30% of ancient Greek historical writing survives. For Latin literature, the survival rate is somewhat better, because Latin was the language of Western medieval church. So Christian scribes had more incentives to preserve Latin texts, but we still have lost huge amounts. Of Roman dramas, we have perhaps 20 to 30% of what was written. Of Latin poetry, maybe 30 to 40%. Of Latin prose, the survival rates vary, but overall we've lost more than we've kept. For non-Greek and non-Latin ancient literature, Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, Phoenician, Etruscan, and countless other cultures, the loss is even more catastrophic. Much of what we have comes from archaeological discoveries of texts, like the Dead Sea Scroll or the clay tablets from Mesopotamia. Literature that existed only in perishable materials and wasn't continuously copied is almost entirely lost. One scholar estimated that we have perhaps 1% of ancient Greek and Roman literature. That might be too pessimistic. Perhaps it's 5% or even 10%. But even at 10%, it means 90% of classical literature is gone forever, and much of what was lost was in the Library of Alexandria. The loss of the Library of Alexandria, and the wider loss of ancient knowledge, had cascading effects throughout history. Knowledge builds on previous knowledge. When you lose fundamental work, you also lose all the work that would have built on it. If Aristarchus of Samos' writing on heliocentrism had survived and been widely read, would heliocentrism have been accepted centuries earlier? Would the scientific revolution have begun in the 5th century CE instead of the 17th? If Hero of Alexandria's work on steam engines had been fully preserved and studied, would the Industrial Revolution have come in the 5th century instead of the 18th? If more mathematical works had survived, would calculus have been invented by the Greeks or Romans instead of waiting for Newton and Leibniz? We cannot know, of course. History doesn't follow straight lines. Knowledge isn't simply cumulative. It requires the right social, economic, and political conditions to flourish. The Greek and Romans had intellectual capacity for industrial technology and advanced science, but they may have lacked the economic incentives or social structures to develop them. Or perhaps they were just on the verge of breakthrough when disaster intervened. But we do know that the Renaissance and the scientific revolution were sparked in part by the rediscovery of ancient texts. When Greek manuscripts flowed into Italy from Constantinople in the 15th century, when Arabic translations of Greek texts were translated into Latin in the 12th century, European scholars were electrified. They discovered that ancients had known things that medieval Europe had forgotten. This inspired them to push beyond ancient knowledge, but they first had to recover it. What else might have been possible if more ancient knowledge had survived? We'll never know, and that's part of the tragedy. Part 6. Theories of Decline, Piecing Together the Puzzle. Let us return now to examine each theory of the library's destruction in detail, weighing the evidence, considering the arguments, and trying to reach a conclusion, knowing that absolute certainty is impossible given the fragmentary evidence. Theory 1. Caesar's fire, 48 BCE. Julius Caesar's burning of the Alexandrian fleet in 48 BCE destroyed the Great Library. Evidence in favor. Plutarch, writing around 100 CE, about 150 years after the event, explicitly states in his Life of Caesar that fires spread from the dockyards and destroyed the Great Library. Cassius Dio, writing in early 3rd century CE, mentions the fire spreading and destroying warehouses containing books. Seneca the Younger, writing around 50 CE, mentions that 40,000 books were burned in Alexandria, though he doesn't explicitly connect this to Caesar's fire or identify which library. It's undeniable that Caesar did set fire to the fleet, and fire did spread to parts of the city. This is confirmed by multiple sources, including Caesar's own account. Later writers seem to assume something was lost in Caesar's time, suggesting this was a well-known tradition. Evidence against. Caesar himself, in his commentaries on the Civil War, describes the fire but says nothing about a library being destroyed. This is strange if such a catastrophic cultural loss occurred during his campaign. Other contemporaries or near-contemporary sources that describe the Alexandrian War, like the anonymous Alexandrian War, possibly written by one of Caesar's officers, don't mention the library. Strabo, who visited Alexandria around 20 BCE, just 20 years after Caesar's fire, describes the museum and seems to treat it as a functioning institution. Would he not have mentioned if the Great Library had been destroyed so recently? The topography is problematic. The harbor and dockyard were at the northern edge of the city. The library in the Bruchion was inland, in the palace quarter. Fire spreading from the docks to the library would have had to jump significant distance and burn through other structures. Plutarch and Cassius Dio were writing 150 to 250 years after the events. They may have been confused or may have been relying on inaccurate sources. Possible reconstructions. The warehouses theory. Perhaps what burned were warehouses near the docks containing scrolls awaiting shipment or distributions. These might have been part of the library's acquisition system, books confiscated from the ships, books being sent to another library, duplicate copies for trade. The loss of 40,000 scrolls from such warehouses would have been significant but not catastrophic to the main collection. Partial destruction. Perhaps fires did reach part of the palace complex, including some library buildings, but not the main library. The institution survived but was weakened. Later confusion. Perhaps Plutarch and later writers confused different events, attributing to Caesar's time losses that actually occurred during other disasters. Modern scholarly consensus. Most scholars today believe that something was lost in 48 BCE, but probably not the main library building, and not the bulk of the collection. The warehouses theory is popular. The library probably survived Caesar's time, damaged but intact. The significance of Caesar's fire may be not that it destroyed the library, but that it marked the beginning of the end. After 48 BCE, Egypt was effectively a Roman protectorate. The days of lavish Ptolemaic royal patronage were ending. The library probably never received the same level of support again, beginning a slow decline that would take centuries to complete. Theory 2. Gradual decline through the Roman period, 1st through 3rd century CE. This theory suggests that the library did not die a single catastrophe, but gradually declined through the Roman period due to changing priorities, reduced funding, and accumulating minor damages. Evidence in favor. References to the Museum and the library become increasingly rare in sources from the 1st through 3rd century CE. This could suggest it was declining in importance. The Roman Empire, while it valued Greek culture, had different priorities than the Ptolemies. Rome was focused on military expansion, administration of a vast empire, and internal political struggles. Funding an Alexandrian research institute may have seemed less important. Egypt was now a province, not an independent kingdom. Provincial institutions generally receive less funding than royal ones. Multiple disasters struck Alexandria during this period: riots, earthquakes, and economic troubles. Each might have damaged the library or diverted resources from its maintenance. Papyrus deteriorates over time. Without constant recopying, even an untouched library would eventually lose its collection to decay. Evidence against. We do have evidence of continued scholarship in Alexandria during the Roman period. Scholars like Claudius Ptolemy, the astronomer-geographer, in the 2nd century CE clearly had access to extensive resources. Some Roman emperors, particularly Hadrian, were Philhellenists who patronized Greek culture and might have supported the library. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Our sources for this period are limited. The library might have continued functioning even if it wasn't frequently mentioned. The Aurelian Siege, 272 CE. A significant event that probably delivered a serious blow was the Emperor Aurelian's siege and sack of Alexandria in 272 CE. Aurelian was suppressing a separatist movement led by Queen Zenobia of Palmyra and her Egyptian ally Firmus. After capturing the city, Aurelian's forces destroyed much of the Bruchion quarter, precisely where the original library stood. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the late 4th century, mentions that the Bruchion was destroyed. If the library still existed there in 272 CE, it probably didn't survive Aurelian's siege. But most scholars think the library was already gone by then, or had already declined to a shadow of its former self. The library that Aurelian might have destroyed was probably a remnant, not the vibrant institution of Ptolemaic times. 5th through 7th centuries. Continued deterioration of whatever survived. Byzantine-Persian wars, religious conflicts, economic decline, earthquakes, and simple neglect took their toll. Any surviving artifacts from the ancient Mausoleum were probably unrecognized relics by this point, scattered and without proper documentation. The physical collection died not in a single catastrophe, but through accumulated losses over centuries. Some artifacts might have been deliberately destroyed, others looted for their material value, others simply left to decay. Still others dispersed to various collections where they lost their identity in context. The loss of physical artifact is particularly haunting because, unlike texts, they couldn't be copied. If you had the last surviving elephant from India and it died without replacement, that was it. The zoo no longer had Indian elephants. If you had the only working model of Archimedes' planetarium and it was destroyed, you couldn't just make another copy without deep understanding of its mechanisms. Physical objects also degrade in a way that texts don't. A scroll protected from fire and moisture can last centuries, but a living plant dies in days without water. A preserved specimen decays despite best efforts. A mechanical device's moving parts wear out. Physical collections require much more active maintenance than text collections. And when physical objects are destroyed, we often don't even know what we've lost. We know we've lost plays by Sophocles because ancient writers mentioned them by title. But how many scientific instruments were there? What specimens were in the natural history collection? We can only guess based on the few fragments that survived or were described in texts. This leads to a tantalizing question. Might some artifacts from the Library of Alexandria still exist, unrecognized in modern museums or private collections? It's not impossible. Ancient bronze instruments occasionally turn up in archaeological digs or old collections. The antique Hypatia, a mechanism, sat in a museum for decades before anyone realized how sophisticated it was. Could other ancient astronomical or mathematical devices be misidentified in storage rooms? Ancient botanical specimens, if preserved in dry climates, might survive. The Egyptians were masters of preservation. Could dry plants from Mausoleum gardens still exist in some forgotten collection? Objects taken as loot or souvenirs during various disasters might have ended up far from Alexandria. A Roman soldier in 272 CE might have taken a bronze instrument back to Gaul. A Byzantine official in the 6th century might have taken a sculpture to Constantinople. An Arab merchant in the 8th century might have acquired an ancient map. These objects could have passed through many hands, their origins forgotten. The problem is identification. Without provenance, documented history of where an object came from, how would we know if an ancient Greek instrument came from Alexandria? We might recognize it as Hellenistic, as scientifically sophisticated, as rare and valuable, but proving it came from the Museion would be nearly impossible. Still, the possibility exists. Modern analytical techniques, metallurgical analysis, radiocarbon dating, study of manufacturing techniques might someday identify objects as coming from Ptolemaic Alexandria. It's a slim hope, but hope nonetheless. The destruction of the Serapeum is the one event we can date with certainty, and for which we have contemporaneous or near contemporaneous accounts. But as we've discussed, whether this involved the destruction of a library remains frustratingly unclear. What we know happened. In 391 CE, the Christian Emperor Theodosius I issued edicts against pagan worship. The Patriarch Theophilus of Alexandria led campaigns to destroy pagan temples and convert them to Christian use. When Theophilus exposed the ritual of pagan cults to ridicule, violence broke out between pagans and Christians. Pagans barricaded themselves in the Serapeum temple. Some Christian prisoners were allegedly tortured and killed. The emperor sent word pardoning the pagans, but ordered the Serapeum destroyed. Christian mobs led by Theophilus demolished the temple. The great statue of Serapis was now destroyed. What we don't know, whether there was still a functioning library in the Serapeum in 391 CE. If there was, whether it was destroyed during the temple's demolition or had been removed beforehand. How large such a library was if it existed. Whether any books were burned, hidden, looted, or dispersed. The puzzling silence. The most puzzling thing about the Serapeum's destruction is that contemporary sources don't mention a library. We have accounts by Socrates Galacticus, 439 CE, Sozomen, 450 CE, Rufinus of Aquileia, 402 CE, Theodoret, 450 CE. None of them mentioned a library being destroyed. Why not? Possible explanations include 1. There was no library to destroy. By 391 CE, the daughter library in the Serapeum had already been emptied, dispersed, or had declined to insignificance. When Orosius visited around 415 CE and saw empty shelves, he was seeing shelves that had been emptied for years or decades. Books were removed before destruction. When it became clear the Serapeum would be destroyed, scholars or sympathetic Christians removed the books to save them. This might explain the silence. There was no dramatic book burning because the books were already gone. 3. The library wasn't considered important. To the Christian writers describing these events, the important thing was the destruction of a pagan temple and the triumph of Christianity. A few thousand old scrolls, many of them probably duplicates of texts available elsewhere, others being pagan religious texts nobody wanted anyway, didn't seem worth mentioning. 4. The library was destroyed, but records were suppressed. Some historians suggest that the library was destroyed, and Christian authorities suppressed mentions of it because it reflected badly on the church. But this seems unlikely. The sources we have are generally honest about Christian violence against pagans in other contexts. Modern scholars are divided. Some believe the Serapeum library was destroyed in 391 CE. Others believe it had already ceased to exist. A middle position is that some collection existed, but had greatly declined from its earlier glory, and its loss wasn't particularly noteworthy in the context of the temple's destruction. What's clearer is that 391 CE marked a symbolic end to the classical pagan tradition in Alexandria, whether or not it involved the physical destruction of a library. Theory 4. The Arab Conquest, 642 CE. We've already discussed why the story of Caliph Umar ordering the library burned is almost certainly false, but it's worth examining why this myth has been so persistent. 1. It provides closure. People want a definitive answer to the mystery of the library's destruction, a dramatic story. Caliph Umar's stark logic, burning books for 6 months in bathhouses, is more satisfying than it probably declined gradually over centuries due to multiple crises. 2. It fits prejudices. For centuries, this story served anti-Muslim propaganda, portraying Muslims as destroyers of civilization. This was particularly useful during the Crusades and later periods of Christian-Muslim conflicts. 3. It was repeated by respected historians. When Edward Gibbon included the story in Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in the 18th century, it gained scholarly respectability that it didn't deserve. 4. It obscures Christian responsibility. If Muslims destroyed the library in 642 CE, then Christians couldn't be blamed for the Serapeum's destruction in 391 CE, or for centuries of neglect of classical learning. Some Christians found this story convenient. By 642 CE, the Great Library of Alexandria was almost certainly long gone. What library existed in Alexandria then were probably Christian institutions, church libraries, monastery libraries, perhaps some private collections. The Arab conquerors had no particular reason to destroy these. In fact, many Christian institutions continued functioning under early Muslim rule. As Islam granted people of the book, Christians and Jews protected status. The story of Umar burning the library is a myth, but it's a revealing myth. It shows how history can be rewritten to serve contemporary needs, and how difficult it is to know the truth about events that happened long ago. Theory 4. Hidden scrolls and secret caches. Despite the scholarly consensus that the library's collections were largely lost, there has always been an undercurrent of hope, the tantalizing idea that perhaps some of those ancient scrolls escaped destruction. Over the years, a variety of legends and speculative theories have arisen about hidden archives or underground vaults related to the Library of Alexandria. These stories speak to a deep human wish that knowledge so precious could not simply vanish without a trace, that somewhere, somehow, a remnant of the great library still lies waiting to be discovered. One such legend involves the warren of tunnels beneath the Serapeum. Archaeologists have uncovered a network of subterranean galleries cut into the bedrock under the Serapeum's vicinity. These catacombs feature rows of niche carved into the walls, clearly designed to hold scrolls or small artifacts. It's easy to imagine librarians in the library's later years quietly moving boxes of scrolls into these vaults for safekeeping, perhaps during one of the city's many crises. Indeed, some popular retelling suggests that when danger loomed, say Caesar's fire or the riot of 391, librarians stashed valuable manuscripts in secret underground rooms to protect them. The romantic notion is that these scrolls might still be there, sealed behind some forgotten wall or in a collapsed tunnel under the earth. So far, however, Excavations have not yielded ancient book hoards in these niches, only the niches themselves empty and mute. The tunnels under the Serapeum were likely well known in antiquity and would have been ransacked or cleared out during the Serapeum's destruction or afterward. Still, next to those vacant shelves, a visitor today can't help but wonder, what volumes once rested here, and were they carried off or burned, or are a few still hiding just out of reach of our spades? Another enduring idea is that some of the library's texts weren't destroyed at all, but rather dispersed far and wide, turning up later in other collections. This is less a legend and more a historical probability. For instance, the Great Library of Pergamum in Asia Minor was said to be second only to Alexandria's. Plutarch relates a story that Mark Antony, in a grand romantic gesture, gave Cleopatra the entire Pergamum library, 200,000 volumes, to replenish Alexandria after the Caesar fire. A story that may be apocryphal, but reflects a perceived continuity of knowledge between collections. It's conceivable that when the writing was on the wall for the Serapeum in 391, some scholars smuggled prized scrolls out and took them to other safe havens, perhaps to private homes or out into the desert monasteries that were blossoming in Egypt by then. The Nag Hammadi Library, a cache of Gnostic scriptures found buried in a jar in Upper Egypt dating to the 4th century, is a real example of how codices were hidden in response to religious suppression. Could some pagan literature have been similarly hidden? We have no direct evidence, but it's an alluring possibility. Over the centuries, various claims have been made of discovering books from the library in unlikely places. Medieval Arabic historians sometimes spoke of finding ancient books in Alexandria's old quarter, or in the houses of scholars. In more modern times, the imagination of fiction writers has run wild. Tales of secret chambers under the Sphinx at Giza, containing the remnants of the library, or of a few survivors of the library's destruction carrying scrolls to distant lands. While these are fanciful, they underscore an emotional truth. We want to believe not everything was lost. There's also the notion that maybe the Vatican Library or other ancient repositories around the world hold a few unidentified scrolls that once belonged to Alexandria. After all, the spread of Christianity and later Islam did not entirely wipe out classical literature. Many works survived in monasteries and were translated to Syriac or Arabic. It's poetic to think that a manuscript sitting on a shelf in some dusty monastic library in Greece or a storeroom in Istanbul might, if traced back far enough, have an Alexandrian pedigree, perhaps bearing the stamp of the Ptolemies or marginal notes by an Alexandrian scholar. These connections are nearly impossible to prove, but the flow of books in the ancient world was certainly fluid. For example, some of the Greek manuscripts in Byzantine collections could hypothetically descend from copies made in Alexandria. So far, no dramatic cache of Library of Alexandria scrolls has ever been found. Unlike the Dead Sea Scrolls or the aforementioned Nag Hammadi texts, we have not yet opened an earthen jar to reveal a lost Euripides play or Aristotle's second volume of Poetics with an Alexandrian library tag on it. If such a discovery ever occurred, the destruction and decay were thorough, and yet a spark of hope remains among scholars and archaeologists. Alexandria is a city of deep layers, much of it unexcavated or built over. Who knows what might lie beneath a mound or under a later structure? In 2004, archaeologists diving in Alexandria's eastern harbor, where the royal palaces once stood, discovered drowned ruins that they believe might include parts of the ancient royal quarter. Statues, columns, even entire temple structures have been mapped underwater. If part of the mausoleum or library complex slid into the sea after earthquakes, Alexandria suffered major quakes in later centuries, it's conceivable that remnants, even waterlogged papyrus in sealed containers, might lurk below silt and coral. It's a long shot, but not beyond imagining. Beyond literal hidden scrolls, there's also a metaphorical hidden legacy, the knowledge from the library that survived because it was copied into new works. Many later authors from other parts of the world had access to Alexandrian scholarship and incorporated it. For example, the great physician Galen in the 2nd century CE spent time in Alexandria and likely used texts preserved there. His prolific writing preserved fragments of earlier treatises. The mathematician Pappus, 4th century, and Theon of Alexandria cite works that might have come from the library's collection. In this sense, pieces of the library were hidden in the books of later authors, embedded like gems in a matrix. All these musings point to one thing: the Library of Alexandria haunts us. We cannot help but dream that something of it endured, waiting to be rediscovered. Maybe it's simply hard to accept that so colossal a trove could vanish utterly. As long as that discomfort remains, people will spin theories of secret libraries and rescued scrolls. In a quiet corner of our collective imagination, a lone librarian scurries down a dark tunnel with a lamp, arms full of scrolls, determined to save some precious wisdom from the flame. It's an image both heartbreaking and hopeful. Whether true or not, it reminds us how much we value the knowledge of the past, enough to invent ways it might have slipped past oblivion's grasp. Part 7. The Legacy. What the library means today. Though the library itself is gone, the search for its remains continues. Modern archaeology has revealed much about ancient Alexandria, though the city's continuous occupation and the rise of the Mediterranean Sea have made excavation challenging. In the 1990s and 2000s, underwater archaeologists explored Alexandria's harbor, submerged due to earthquakes and rising sea levels. They discovered remains of ancient cities, columns, statues, sections of buildings, possibly including parts of the royal palace complex where the library stood. These finds give us a tantalizing glimpse of Alexandria's glory, but the library building itself has not been definitively identified. On land, excavations have uncovered parts of ancient Alexandria's street plans, sections of the ancient walls in various buildings. In 2004, during construction work, archaeologists discovered 13 lecture halls from the Roman period. These may have been part of the mausoleum complex. The halls could accommodate 5,000 students total, suggesting that Alexandria remained a major educational center even in later periods. These discoveries, while not revealing the library building itself, help us reconstruct what ancient Alexandria was like, its size, wealth, sophistication, and commitment to learning. In 2002, near the site of the ancient library, Egypt opened the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a modern library and cultural center explicitly intended to recapture the spirit of the ancient institution. The project was initiated by Egypt and supported by UNESCO. The building, designed by Norwegian architects, is a striking modernist structure, a massive cylindrical form tilted towards the Mediterranean. its walls inscribed with characters from 120 different writing systems, symbolizing the library's universal mission. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina contains space for 8 million books, currently holding about 1 million, 4 specialized libraries for books, young people, children, and the visually impaired, 4 museums, antiquities, manuscripts, science, and history, a planetarium, multiple art galleries, a conference center, research facilities, and conservation laboratories. The library has become a major cultural center for Egypt and the Middle East. It hosts conferences, exhibitions, and performances. It digitizes rare texts and makes them available online. It's not trying to recreate the ancient library, that would be impossible, but it's trying to embody the same spirit, gathering knowledge, making it accessible, fostering scholarship, and serving as a meeting place for ideas. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina reminds us that while the ancient library is lost, its dream is not. The vision of a universal library, containing all human knowledge and open to all who seek wisdom, continues to inspire us. In our modern age, we're attempting something the ancient Alexandrians could only dream of, creating a truly universal library accessible to everyone on Earth. Projects like Google Books, the Internet Archive, Project Gutenberg, and Wikipedia are digitizing texts and making them freely available online. The Internet Archive alone has digitized millions of books, archived billions of web pages, and preserved countless videos, audio recordings, and software programs. In many ways, the Internet is the Library of Alexandria's spiritual successor, a repository of human knowledge, growing constantly, accessible in principle to anyone with an internet connection. Like Alexandria, it attempts to gather all knowledge without regards to borders or cultures. But the internet also faces challenges that would have been familiar to ancient librarians. Preservation. Digital information is fragile in ways physical books are not. File formats become obsolete. Websites disappear. Hard drives fail. The internet's contents are constantly changing, and much is being lost. The Internet Archive's Wayback Machine tries to preserve old websites, but it's an overwhelming task. Digital preservation requires constant active effort, just as preserving papyrus scrolls require constant recopying. Curation and quality control. Alexandria had librarians who selected, organized, and authenticated texts. The internet has no such gatekeepers. Anyone can post anything. This democratization of knowledge has enormous benefits, but it also means misinformation spreads alongside accurate information. Separating truth from falsehoods, quality from garbage, requires critical thinking skills that not everyone possesses. Access and inequality. While the internet is theoretically accessible to all, in practice, billions of people lack reliable internet access. Language barrier persists. Most online content is in English, Chinese, Spanish, and a few other major languages. Digital literacy is required. The dream of a universal access remains incompletely fulfilled. Catastrophic loss. The Library of Alexandria reminds us that even the greatest repositories can be lost. Digital information faces its own catastrophic risks: cyber attacks, electromagnetic pulses, solar storms, format obsolescence. The internet is more resilient than a single library because information is distributed across millions of servers worldwide. But large-scale losses are possible. Despite these challenges, the digital age offers unprecedented opportunities for preserving and sharing knowledge. For the first time in history, we have the technical means to preserve the entirety of human knowledge and make it available to everyone. Whether we'll actually do so remains to be seen. The Library of Alexandria has become more than a historical institution. It's become a symbol, a metaphor, even a myth. But what does it symbolize? The fragility of knowledge. The library reminds us that knowledge is not permanent. It must be actively preserved and transmitted, or it will be lost. Every library, archive, and museum is a bulwark against forgetting, but none are permanent. The cost of fanaticism. Whether or not religious fanaticism actually destroyed the library, the story of its destruction has become associated with the dangers of extremism, anti-intellectualism, and the suppression of learning. The library symbolizes what's lost when ideologies overrides reason, when purity is valued above knowledge, when books are burned rather than read. The dream of universal knowledge. More positively, the library represents an ideal, that all knowledge can be gathered, organized, and made accessible. That learning transcends borders and cultures. That wisdom is humanity's common heritage. This dream inspires libraries, universities, and digital archives today. The meeting of cultures. Alexandria under Ptolemies was a cosmopolitan city where Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and other cultures interacted. The library gathered texts from many civilizations. It symbolizes the richness that comes from cultural exchange and the poverty that comes from isolation. The glory and tragedy of classical civilization. The library represents both the heights that ancient civilizations reached and the depth to which it fell. It reminds us that progress is not inevitable, that civilizations can rise and decline, that what one generation builds, another can destroy or neglect. Unanswered questions. Finally, the library symbolizes mystery itself, the things we don't know, the questions we can't answer, the knowledge we've lost and can never recover. It reminds us of the limits of historical knowledge and the importance of preserving evidence for future generations. What can we learn from the Library of Alexandria's story? 1. Preservation requires commitment. Libraries, archives, and museums need continuous support, funding, staffing, maintenance, and public commitment. Neglect is as destructive as violence. The gradual decline of Alexandrian library through reduced support and changing priorities is a warning to our own age. When we cut library budgets, fail to maintain archives, or undervalue educational institutions, we risk our own future Alexandrias. 2. Redundancies is crucial. One reason so much ancient knowledge was lost is that texts often existed in only a few copies or even single copies. When those copies were destroyed, the knowledge was gone forever. Modern preservation strategies emphasizes redundancy, multiple copies in multiple locations in multiple formats. Digital preservation follows this principle. Distribute information across many servers, back up constantly, store in multiple formats. The principle is simple. Never keep all your eggs in one basket. 3. Access matters. Knowledge preserved but not accessible is nearly as useless as knowledge destroyed. The Library of Alexandria's genius was not just gathering texts, but making them available to scholars. Today, we face similar questions. Should academic journals be behind paywalls? Should digitized books be freely available or sold? Should archives be open or restricted? The tension between preservation, compensation, and access democracy is ongoing. 4. Cultural memory is collective. The library wasn't destroyed by one event, but declined through many causes over centuries. Similarly, cultural memory is maintained not by single institutions, but by entire societies. We all have responsibility for preserving knowledge, supporting libraries, archives, and museums, reading and sharing books, teaching our children, valuing education and truth. 5. Loss is irreversible. Perhaps the most sobering lesson: once knowledge is lost, it's lost forever. We can sometimes reconstruct or rediscover it, but the original is gone. Every extinct language, every burned book, every demolished building, every lost tradition represents irreplaceable human heritage. We should be cautious about discarding anything because we can't always predict what future generations will value or need. 6. Technology is not enough. The Ptolemies had the technology to preserve their collection: papyrus, scribes, storage facilities. What changed wasn't technology, but priorities, values, and political circumstances. Similarly, having servers in digitalization technology doesn't guarantee preservation. We need the will to preserve, the resources to do so, and the political stability and cultural commitment to maintain preservation efforts across generations. 7. Hope endures. Despite everything lost, much survived. Some texts made it through multiple disasters, were copied and recopied, survived in monastery libraries or Arabic translations, and eventually reached us. The scholars of the Renaissance recovered much ancient knowledge and built on it. We stand on the shoulders of giants, even if some giants are missing. The Library of Alexandria may be gone, but the project it represented, gathering and preserving human knowledge, continues. Part 8. The Unsolved Mysteries. As we drift towards the end of our journey, let us contemplate the mysteries that remained unsolved. Despite centuries of scholarship, many questions about the Library of Alexandria have no definitive answers. When was it founded? Most scholars say around 295 BCE, but some argue for earlier or later dates. We don't know the exact year or even who founded it, Ptolemy I or Ptolemy II. Where exactly was it? We know it was in the Bruchion, the royal quarter, but the exact location has never been definitively identified through archaeology. The continuous occupied site and risen sea levels make discovery difficult. How large was it? Ancient sources give wildly varying numbers, from 40,000 to 700,000 scrolls. We don't know the true figure, and we don't even know how to interpret the numbers. Did ancient writers count each individual scroll or each work, some of which require multiple scrolls? What did it look like? We have no detailed architectural descriptions. Was it one building or multiple? How were the scrolls stored and organized? What did the reading rooms look like? We can only guess based on other Hellenistic buildings and scattered references. What exactly did it contain? We can estimate based on what survived and what ancient sources mentioned, but we'll never know the full contents. How many lost masterpieces? How many unique texts? How many one-of-a-kind copies were there? When and how did it end? This is the central mystery. Did it burn in 48 BCE, decline gradually through the Roman period, end in 272 CE during Aurelian's siege, continue in the Serapeum until 391 CE? We have theories, but no certainty. What happened to the books? Even if the buildings were destroyed, books are portable. Where did the scrolls go? Were any hidden and still waiting to be discovered? Were they dispersed to other libraries, stolen by looters, destroyed deliberately, lost to decay? Did any of it survive? Might there be texts from library preserved in unexpected places, buried in the Egyptian desert, held in some monastery or private collection, misidentified in some archive? Every few years, scholars discover new ancient texts, palimpsests where earlier writing was scraped off and written over, papyri preserved in dry climates, texts misattributed or misfiled. Might some of these be from Alexandria? These unanswered questions give the library its enduring fascination. It's not the knowledge that was lost that intrigues us, but the mystery of how and when it was lost, and the tantalizing possibility that some of it might yet be recovered. Despite the passage of millennia, the search for the library continues. Archaeologists keep excavating in Alexandria, underwater and on land. Literary scholars keep analyzing ancient texts for clues. Historians keep reinterpreting the evidence. And occasionally there are discoveries. The villa of the papyri at Herculaneum. In the 18th century, excavators discovered a Roman villa buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. The villa contained a library of about 1,800 papyrus scrolls, carbonized by volcanic heat but potentially readable. These scrolls are still being studied using cutting-edge technology. They contain primarily philosophical works, particularly Epicurean texts. This gives us a glimpse of what an ancient library was like. They give us a glimpse of what an ancient library was like and raise the question, might similar discoveries await Egypt? The Oxyrhynchus papyri. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists discovered an enormous cache of papyri in an ancient garbage dump at Oxyrhynchus in Egypt. Hundreds of thousands of fragments have been recovered, including portions of lost literary works. Among the finds, poems by Sappho, plays by Sophocles and Euripides, historical works, mathematical texts, and much more. Scholars are still working through the Oxyrhynchus papyri today, publishing new texts regularly. These finds prove that lost texts can still be discovered. Digital technology. New imaging techniques can read texts that appear blank to the human eye. Multispectral imaging, X-rays, fluorescence, particle accelerators. These tools can reveal writing on damaged, faded, or palimpsest documents. The Archimedes palimpsest, a medieval prayer book written over a 10th century copy of Archimedes' works, was read using such technology in the 2000s, revealing mathematical treatises that had been thought lost. The hope for Alexandria. Might similar technology someday read carbonized papyri buried in Alexandria's ruins? Might underwater archaeology discover sealed chambers with preserved texts? Might some remote monastery or private collection contain misidentified Alexandrian manuscripts? It's unlikely but not impossible. The dream of recovering the library or parts of it persists, and even if we never find the physical library, every ancient text we discover or decipher brings us closer to understanding what was lost and recapturing some of the knowledge of the ancients. Let us indulge in some historical speculation. What if the Library of Alexandria had survived intact into the modern era? How might history have been different? Scientific progress. With continuous preservation of ancient scientific knowledge, the scientific revolution might have come centuries earlier. Aristarchus' heliocentrism might have been accepted. Hero's steam engine might have led to industrial technology in antiquity or in the Middle Ages. Mathematical advances might have accelerated. Medicine might have built continuously on Herophilus in Erasistratus rather than regressing and having to rediscover anatomy in the Renaissance. Technological development. Ancient engineering knowledge, how the pyramids were built, how Roman aqueducts work, techniques for metalworking and construction, might have been preserved and improved upon. We might have reached our current technological level centuries earlier, or we might be far more advanced than we are. Cultural continuity. Without the sharp break between classical antiquity and the Middle Ages, Western culture might have developed more continuously. Classical philosophy, literature, and art might have remained more central. Or perhaps medieval Christian culture would have developed differently if it had continuous access to pagan classical texts. Religious history. The preservation of pagan philosophical and religious texts might have led to different theological developments. Early Christianity developed in dialogue with classical philosophy. How might it have developed with fuller access to ancient texts? Might Gnosticism or other alternative Christian movement have been more successful? The Islamic Golden Age. Much of the Islamic Golden Age was built on the preservation and study of Greek texts translated into Arabic. If more Greek texts had survived, Islamic science and philosophy might have reached even greater heights, which in turn might have influenced Europe when these texts were translated into Latin during the High Middle Ages. Modern scholarship. Simply having more ancient texts would transform our understanding of ancient world. We would know far more about ancient history, culture, daily life, science, technology, art, and thought. Classical studies would be a richer field, and having more examples of ancient literature might have influenced modern literature. We might have different literary traditions, different canonical texts, different aesthetic values. But historical what-ifs are always speculative. History is complex with countless interlocking causes. The preservation of the library alone wouldn't guarantee any particular outcome. Social, economic, political, and cultural factors matter as much as or more than access to knowledge. The ancient world had knowledge to create steam engines, but not the economic system that would make them profitable. Medieval Europe might have preserved the library, but still lacked the political stability and economic development to use that knowledge productively. Still, it's fascinating to imagine. The loss of the library represents lost potential, not just the knowledge itself, but all that might have been built upon it. Part 8. Conclusion. And so we come to the end of our long journey through the mystery of the Library of Alexandria. We have traveled from its glorious founding in the 3rd century BCE, through its slow decline and eventual disappearance. We have met the scholars who made it great. We have examined the theories of its destruction. We have contemplated what was lost and why it matters. But in the end, the central mystery remains unsolved. We don't know exactly when the library ended or how, or whether some of it might yet survive undiscovered. We have clues, theories, educated guesses, but not certainty. Perhaps this is fitting. The library has become a symbol of mystery itself, of the things we cannot know, the questions we cannot answer, the knowledge that lies forever beyond our reach. Every mystery needs its mystery, and the Library of Alexandria keeps its secret. Yet our journey has not been in vain. Even if we cannot solve the mystery completely, we have learned much. We have learned that the library was not just a building, but an institution, a community of scholars dedicated to gathering, preserving, and advancing knowledge. We have learned that it represented the first systematic attempt to collect all human knowledge in one place and make it accessible to all who sought wisdom. We have learned that knowledge is fragile and requires constant active effort to preserve. We have learned that libraries can decline gradually through neglect as easily as they can be destroyed suddenly through violence. We have learned that the loss was catastrophic, that centuries of accumulated knowledge, the works of the greatest minds of antiquity, are gone forever. We have learned that this loss rippled through history, affecting the development of science, literature, philosophy, and culture for centuries. But we have also learned that the spirit of Alexandria lives on in modern libraries and universities, in digital archives and preservation projects, in everyone who values learning and seeks to preserve and share knowledge. The dream that animated the Library of Alexandria, that all knowledge should be gathered, preserved, and made freely available to all who seek it, is still alive. Every public library, every university, every free online encyclopedia is an echo of Alexandria. The librarians who help students find information, the archivists who preserve historical documents, the programmers who maintain digital archives, the teachers who share knowledge with their students, all are continuing the work begun by Ptolemy I and Demetrius of Phalerum over 2,000 years ago. We live in an age when the dream of Alexandria is more achievable than ever. The internet makes it possible, in principle, to give everyone on Earth access to all human knowledge. We can digitize books faster than the ancients could copy them by hand. We can preserve information in multiple formats and locations, making catastrophic loss less likely. We can connect scholars across continents instantly, creating a global community of learning that Alexandria could only have dreamed of. The challenges are real: digital preservation, information quality, access inequalities, cultural barriers. But for the first time in history, the technical possibilities exist to create a truly universal library, a real world or digital world embodiment of Alexandria's ideal. Whether we will actually do so depends on us, on whether we value knowledge enough to invest in its preservation and sharing, whether we believe in free access to information, whether we're willing to support libraries and education and scholarly research, even when the immediate practical benefits aren't obvious. And now, dear listener, as we finish our long journey, let your mind grow quiet and your breathing slow. Close your eyes and imagine. Imagine walking through the halls of the Library of Alexandria in its golden age. The Mediterranean sun streams through the windows. The air smells of papyrus and ink and the sea. Scrolls line the walls, stretching into the distance, thousands upon thousands of them, containing all the knowledge of the ancient world. You reach out and touch a scroll. Perhaps it contains a play by Sophocles, that no one has read for 2,000 years. Perhaps it's a scientific treatise that would have changed history if it had survived. Perhaps it's a poem of such beauty that it would make you weep. You cannot read it. The letters are in ancient Greek, fading on the papyrus. But you understand that you are touching the accumulated wisdom of generations, the product of thousands of minds working over thousands of years to understand the world and record their understanding. And then imagine that you release the scroll and it transforms. It becomes a book in modern library. It becomes digitized text. It becomes a teacher explaining something to a student. It becomes a scientist making a discovery. It becomes you, here and now, learning something new. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but its spirit lives on in every act of learning, every moment of discovery, every time knowledge is preserved and shared. The scrolls have turned to dust, but the ideas they contained have scattered like seed and taken root in new soil, growing into new forms. As you drift off to sleep, imagine yourself in that infinite library where nothing is lost, where all the books ever written still exist, where all questions have answers. Imagine walking those halls forever, learning endlessly, understanding deeply. The Library of Alexandria waits for you there, in the realm of dreams, perfect and complete, containing all wisdom, offering all knowledge. It's a comforting thought that somewhere in some realm, the library still exists. Every poem ever written, every discovery ever made, every story ever told, all preserved perfectly, waiting to be read. Perhaps in our dreams, we can visit that perfect library. Perhaps that's what dreams are, libraries of everything we've ever learned or imagined, accessible when the conscious mind grows quiet. As you fall asleep tonight, know that you carry a spark of Alexandria within you, the curiosity that drove ancient scholars to gather knowledge, the love of learning that built the greatest library the world had ever seen, the hope that wisdom can be preserved and shared across generations. Sleep well, dream deeply, and rest in the knowledge that the quest for wisdom continues. The ancient scrolls may be gone, but the search for truth, the joy of discovery, the wonder of learning are eternal. Good night, dear seeker of knowledge. May your dream of infinite libraries of questions answered and mysteries solved, of a world where all wisdom is preserved and all learning is shared. The Library of Alexandria lives on. In our libraries, our schools, our minds, and our dreams. Its scrolls have crumbled to dust, but its vision endures, that all human knowledge should be gathered and preserved, that wisdom should be freely shared, that learning should be celebrated, that the life of the mind is noble and worthy. Sleep peacefully, knowing that every time you open a book, visit a library, teach someone something new, or learn something yourself, you are honoring the memory of the Library of Alexandria.